The snow fell in gentle flakes as the last of the mourners departed, leaving Abigail Winters alone before the fresh grave. The small cemetery of Silver Creek, Wyoming seemed vast and empty, now the weathered headstones standing like silent sentinels against the gray November sky of 1885. She stood motionless, her black mourning dress stark against the gathering white, listening to the whispers that trailed behind the townspeople. 6 months wed and already a widow. Brings bad luck, that one. No wonder the mine collapsed with her husband down there. Abigail closed her eyes, letting the cold flakes kiss her pale cheeks. At 27, she never imagined standing at her husband's grave, the dirt still fresh, the wound in her heart still raw and bleeding. Robert Winters had been laid to rest today, one of 3 men lost in the mine collapse. 4 days of desperate digging had yielded only bodies, and now Abigail faced a future she had never prepared for. Pastor Wallace lingered at the cemetery gate, his weathered face creased with concern. He had been her father's friend, had married her and Robert on that bright spring day that now seemed to belong to another life entirely. "Sister Winters," he said softly, approaching with careful steps, "you shouldn't stay out in this cold. Let me walk you home." Home. The word felt hollow now. The small cabin Robert had built with his own hands no longer seemed like sanctuary, but merely walls and a roof empty of the laughter and dreams they had filled it with. "Thank you, Pastor," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "But I need a few moments more." He nodded, understanding in his tired eyes. "Your father would be proud of your strength, Abigail. Remember what he always taught us. Even in the valley of shadow, we are never truly alone." Abigail nodded, grateful for the reminder of her father's teachings. Reverend James Porter had raised her alone after her mother's death in childbirth, instilling in her not only a deep faith but practical skills few women possessed. Reading, writing, basic medical knowledge gleaned from his missionary work. He had died 2 years prior, leaving Abigail a small inheritance, and his worn Bible, its pages marked with decades of devotion. When the pastor's footsteps faded, Abigail knelt beside the grave, her gloved fingers tracing the roughly carved letters of her husband's name. "Robert," she whispered, memories washing over her like waves. Robert Winters, with his easy smile and gentle hands. The way he whistled every morning while building the fire. How he'd taught her to fish in the creek behind their cabin, laughing at her first clumsy attempts. The promise he'd made just weeks ago, his eyes bright with excitement. "I'll build us a proper house by the stream come spring, Abby," he'd said, twirling her around their tiny kitchen. "With a room for little ones and a porch where you can sit and watch the sunset." Now those dreams lay buried with him, 6 feet of cold Wyoming earth sealing them away forever. The mine collapse had happened during Robert's attempt to save Jake Miller, a man trapped when the first timbers cracked. Others had fled, but Robert had gone back in. They said he died at the hero. But heroes left widows just the same as cowards, and heroism did nothing to warm the empty side of her bed. Snow began falling more heavily, and Abigail finally rose, brushing the dampness from her skirts. The small town of Silver Creek spread before her as she descended the hill. A cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the vast wilderness of smoke rising from chimneys into the gray sky. A town that had welcomed her as Robert's bride, but now seemed to regard her with suspicion, as though widowhood was somehow contagious. "Give them time," she whispered to herself, her father's words coming back to her. "People fear what they don't understand, and grief is the great mystery none wish to comprehend." A month passed, and winter tightened its grip on Silver Creek. Abigail kept to herself, stretching Robert's final wages as far as they would go, taking and mending, when she could, though few brought work to the widow Winters. Each night she read her father's Bible by candlelight, seeking comfort in familiar passages. Though the words sometimes blurred through tears, she only allowed herself in darkness. The knock came on a Tuesday morning, sharp and demanding. Abigail set aside the shirt she was mending and opened the door to find Ezra Winters on her doorstep. Robert's older brother, with the same jawline, but none of his gentleness. He'd attended the funeral with cold eyes, speaking no words of comfort. Now he stood with a document in his gloved hand, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Mrs. Winters," he said, the formality at odds with the contempt in his eyes. "Ezra," she replied, not inviting him in. The cabin was her sanctuary, and she would not have it poisoned by his presence. "What brings you here?" "Legal matters," he said, thrusting the paper toward her. "This cabin and land belong to the Winters family. You have no claim here. I've come to inform you that you have 2 weeks to vacate." Abigail took the document with numb fingers, scanning words that seemed to swim before her eyes. "This can't be right," she said. "Robert built this cabin. We were to homestead this land together." Ezra's laugh held no humor. "Robert never told you he mortgaged this place to pay his debts to me. After our father died, I gave him his portion of the inheritance early. He squandered it and came crawling back." Disbelief washed over her. "I don't believe you. Ask yourself why he married you so quickly after meeting you, Abigail Porter." Ezra's smile turned cruel. A respectable preacher's daughter with a small inheritance of her own. How convenient. "Get out," Abigail whispered, her voice shaking with rage and hurt. 2 weeks, Ezra repeated, already turning away. "And don't think about contesting. The law's on my side." She closed the door and leaned against it, the paper crumpling in her fist. It couldn't be true. Robert had loved her, had courted her with sweet words and sincere eyes. Yet a cold doubt crept in like the winter draft through the cabin's cracks. That night, Abigail did what she had avoided for a month. She opened the small trunk containing Robert's personal effects. Beneath his spare clothes and the watch that had stopped in the mine collapse, she found papers, loan documents, gambling markers, and a bank draft showing her inheritance withdrawn just 3 days after their wedding. The truth cut deeper than any knife. Robert had indeed loved her, but perhaps he had also needed her in ways she hadn't understood. The cabin, which she had believed was theirs, had been mortgaged to pay his brother's loans. The inheritance from her father, which she had willingly shared with her new husband, had vanished. Abigail sat amidst the scattered papers watching the fire die to embers in the hearth. Betrayal mingled with grief in a bitter draught she had no choice but to swallow. Yet beneath the pain something else stirred, a determination born of necessity. She was alone now, but she was her father's daughter. She would find a way forward. The next morning, Abigail walked through Silver Creek's single street with her head held high, inquiring at every business about work. The general store, the seamstress shop, even the saloon with its rough clientele, anywhere that might provide enough income for a room and basic necessities. At each place she met the same response, though the words varied slightly. "We're not hiring Mrs. Winters. Don't need help just now. Not appropriate for a widow woman to work here." By afternoon, Abigail stood before the office of the Silver Creek Mining Company itself, the very operation where Robert had died. The manager, Mr. Phillips, couldn't meet her eyes as he refused her request for clerical work. "Miners are superstitious folk, Mrs. Winters," he explained, fingers drumming nervously on his desk. They believe your husband's death brought bad luck to the mine." "My husband died trying to save another man," Abigail said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Yes, very heroic," Phillips mumbled. "But 3 men dead is 3 men dead. The others, they won't work if you're associated with the company." "I'm sorry." Defeated, Abigail made one final stop, the small church where Pastor Wallace greeted her with sad eyes. He offered what he could, a few dollars from the church poor fund, and advice she didn't want to hear. "Perhaps it's time to consider leaving Silver Creek," he suggested gently. "Your father had family in Carson City, did he not? They might welcome you there." "This was supposed to be my home," Abigail said, staring at the simple wooden cross above the altar. "We had plans, Robert and I." The pastor sighed, his breath visible in the cold church. "People are afraid, Abigail. The mine collapse has shaken everyone. They need someone to blame in grief." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Grief makes for an uncomfortable neighbor. They look at you and see their own mortality reflected back." He pressed a folded paper into her hand. "Your grandmother's address in Carson City. I found it among your father's effects when he passed. It's a long journey, but perhaps a new beginning." That night in the cabin that would soon no longer be hers, Abigail made her decision. There was nothing left for her in Silver Creek, only whispers and closed doors and the fresh grave on the hillside that held her heart. She packed her small carpet bag with what little was truly hers. 2 dresses, her father's Bible, the wedding photograph showing Robert's smile that now seemed tinged with secrets, and the address in Carson City. The inheritance was gone, but she had scraped together enough coins for stage fare if she could reach the station in Rawlins, 40 miles distant. As dawn broke clear and cold, Abigail closed the cabin door behind her. She did not look back at the life she was leaving. The dreams turned to dust. The road stretched before her, rutted and frozen, winding through the vast Wyoming wilderness. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter and began walking, each step taking her further from the peak toward an uncertain future. The first few miles passed in numb determination. The day was clear, the winter sun offering light but little warmth. Abigail's breath clouded before her as she followed the rough road, her carpet bag growing heavier with each mile. She passed no travelers. Few ventured out in winter unless absolutely necessary, and the stagecoach only came through Silver Creek once a week. By midday, clouds gathered on the western horizon, thick and gray with the promise of snow. Abigail quickened her pace, knowing she needed to find shelter before nightfall. The nearest town was still 2 days' walk, but there were scattered homesteads along the way where she might seek refuge for the night. As afternoon waned, the temperature dropped rapidly, and the first snowflakes began to fall. Abigail spotted a farmhouse set back from the road, smoke rising from its chimney. Gathering her courage, she approached and knocked at the door. A woman answered, her face lined with the years of hard work, suspicion immediately clouding her eyes at the sight of a stranger. "I'm traveling to Rawlins," Abigail explained. "I wondered if I might stay in your barn tonight in exchange for work. I can cook or mend." "Where's your husband?" the woman interrupted, eyes narrowing at Abigail's plain dress and carpet bag. "I'm widowed," Abigail replied, the words still strange on her tongue. The woman's expression hardened. "My husband wouldn't like having a widow woman here overnight. Wouldn't be proper." She began closing the door. "Town's that way. Best keep moving." Proper. The word followed Abigail back to the road like a mocking echo. Proper had not saved her from widowhood. Proper had not kept food on her table or a roof over her head. Yet propriety was the weapon wielded against her now, when simple Christian charity might have saved her from the gathering storm. The snow fell harder as she continued, daylight fading too quickly. When she spotted another homestead, Abigail was shivering beneath her inadequate layers. This time an old man answered her knock, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Might have work for you," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Pretty thing like you could use some company on these long winter nights." His laughter followed her as she hurried away, choosing the storm over what his offer implied. By twilight, the snow had become a swirling wall of white. The wind cut through Abigail's clothing, numbing her fingers and toes. Her carpet bag felt impossibly heavy, each step requiring more effort than the last. The road had disappeared beneath the snow, and she feared she had strayed from it in the whiteout conditions. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, the words lost in the wind. "Just keep moving." But her body was failing her. Her legs buckled, sending her to her knees in the deep snow. She tried to rise, fell again. The cold had become almost a comfort, now a seductive numbness, replacing the pain in her extremities. Ahead, a dark shape materialized through the curtain of white, a structure of some kind. Hope flared briefly as Abigail forced herself toward it, only to find a collapsed barn, its roof caved in, offering little shelter from the elements. Still, one corner remained partially intact, and she crawled beneath the wit, huddling against the rotting wood. The storm raged around her sanctuary, driving snow through every gap. Abigail knew what came next, the deadly sleep that preceded freezing to death. She had seen it once as a child when a trapper had been caught in a blizzard and sought shelter in her father's church. By morning, he had been beyond saving. "Father," she whispered, not knowing if she addressed her earthly father or heavenly one, "I'm ready. If this is your will, let me go to them now." She thought of Robert, wondering if his betrayal mattered anymore in the face of eternity. She thought of her father, who had taught her to face life's trials with dignity and faith. As consciousness began to slip away, a strange warmth enveloped her, and with it came a sense of peace. The last thing Abigail remembered was the distant sound of hoofbeats, or perhaps it was only the wind playing tricks on her fading senses. Then darkness claimed her completely. Warmth. That was the first sensation that registered in Abigail's consciousness. Warmth and the crackling sound of a fire. For a moment, she thought perhaps she had died after all, and this was the afterlife her father had preached about with such certainty. Then pain returned. The burning ache of extremities, thawing the rawness of wind-chapped skin. She was alive then. But where Abigail forced heavy eyelids open to find herself in an unfamiliar cabin, larger and sturdier than the one she had shared with Robert. A fire blazed in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on log walls, hung with practical implements. Tools, dried herbs, a rifle. She lay beneath several thick quilts on a narrow bed, her own clothes replaced by a man's flannel shirt that engulfed her frame. Alarm shot through her, and she struggled to sit up, only to fall back as dizziness overwhelmed her. "Easy now," came a woman's voice, rich and deep with a southern cadence. "You've been asleep near 2 days. Body needs time to recover." An elderly black woman moved into Abigail's field of vision, her face creased with concern. She wore a simple dress with a woolen shawl, her gray hair covered by a neat headscarf. "Where am I?" Abigail managed, her throat parched and raw. "Evergreen Ranch," the woman replied, helping Abigail sip water from a tin cup. "Mr. Hayes found you half frozen in that old Weber barn, carried you 3 miles through the blizzard. Thought we might lose you that first night." "Mr. Hayes, the owner of this ranch. I'm Ruth, and my husband Isaiah helps manage the place." Ruth's dark eyes assessed Abigail with motherly concern. "What's your name, child?" "Abigail Winters," she replied, memories of her desperate journey flooding back. "I was trying to reach Rawlins." Ruth clicked her tongue. "In a blizzard that's 40 miles through mountain country. Would have been your death without Mr. Hayes finding you." She adjusted the quilts with practiced hands. "Rest now. You can explain yourself when you're stronger." Over the next day, Abigail drifted between sleep and wakefulness, gradually regaining her strength. Ruth tended to her with capable hands, applying salve to her wind-burned face and frost-nipped fingers. From their brief conversations, Abigail learned she was at a cattle ranch 20 miles from Silver Creek, in a direction she hadn't intended to travel. The storm had disoriented her completely. On the third day, Abigail was strong enough to sit up properly when the cabin door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a tall figure stomping snow from heavy boots. Jackson Hayes was not what she had expected. Perhaps 40 years old, he had the weathered look of a man who lived by the elements, his face tanned and lined from sun and wind. A long scar ran down his left cheek, disappearing into a neatly trimmed beard flecked with silver. His eyes, a startling clear gray, assessed her with clinical detachment. "You're awake," he said, his voice deep but quiet as though unused to much speaking. "Good." Abigail pulled the quilts higher, acutely aware of her state of undress beneath the borrowed shirt. "Mr. Hayes," she said, summoning her dignity, "I'm told I owe you my life." He shrugged off his heavy coat, hanging it by the door. "Found you is all. Ruth did the rest." "Don't you believe him?" Ruth said, entering from what appeared to be a kitchen area. "Carried you through waist-deep snow, talked to you the whole way, though you were unconscious, sat up that first night, making sure you kept breathing." Hayes shot Ruth a look that might have been annoyance, but the older woman merely raised an eyebrow, unintimidated. Your belongings are there, Hayes said, nodding toward Abigail's carpet bag placed neatly beside the bed. Nothing's been touched except to dry out. Thank you, Abigail said, touched by this consideration. Too many would have thought nothing of searching a helpless woman's possessions. Hayes nodded once, then turned to Ruth. Isaiah's bringing in firewood. Dinner ready soon? Half hour, Ruth replied. Just enough time for you to show Mrs. Winters to the foreman's cabin if she's feeling up to moving. Abigail looked between them, confusion evident. Hayes cleared his throat. There's a smaller cabin 50 yards from the main house. Used to belong to the foreman before I started running this place alone. It's yours until you're fully recovered and can travel safely. I couldn't impose, Abigail began. It's empty, Hayes interrupted. Has its own stove bed, more proper than staying here. He said the word proper with a slight edge, as though he found the concept ridiculous. Abigail understood then. He was offering her privacy and protection for her reputation, such as it was. A woman alone in a man's home would raise eyebrows, even in the wilderness. When can I continue to Rawlins? She asked. Hayes looked at her as though she'd suggested flying to the moon. Roads are closed. Will be until spring thaw, most likely. This was just the first storm. Winter's barely begun. The implications sank in slowly. She was stranded here at the mercy of strangers until spring. Months away. I can work, she said quickly, pride rising through her exhaustion. Cook, clean, mend. I won't be a burden. Something that might have been respect flickered in Hayes's eyes. We'll discuss terms when you are stronger. For now, rest, eat, recover. He moved toward the door. I'll check the foreman's cabin, make sure it's habitable. Ruth will help you dress. After he left, Ruth helped Abigail into her own clothes, now clean and dried. Don't mind his manner, Ruth said as she buttoned Abigail's dress. Mr. Hayes doesn't waste words, but he's a good man. You and your husband have worked for him long. Ruth's hand stilled momentarily. Since the war, Isaiah and I were slaves in Georgia. Mr. Hayes was a major in the Union Army, helped free folks on the plantation where we worked. When the war ended, we had nowhere to go, so we came west with him. Her voice softened with memory. Been with him through everything since. There was a weight to her words that suggested everything, encompassed more than Abigail could imagine. Before she could inquire further, Hayes returned, announcing the cabin was ready. The short walk through the snow left Abigail breathless, her body still weak from its ordeal. Hayes supported her with a strong arm, keeping a respectful distance otherwise. The foreman's cabin was indeed small, a single room with a cast-iron stove, narrow bed, rough table and chair, and a few shelves. But it was clean with fresh bedding and a stack of firewood beside the already lit stove. It's not much, Hayes said, watching her take in her temporary home. It's more than I had yesterday, Abigail replied honestly. I'm grateful. He nodded, seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. Ruth will bring your dinner over. Rest tonight. Tomorrow's soon enough to talk about arrangements. As he turned to leave, Abigail called after him. Mr. Hayes, why did you save me? You could have ridden past that old barn. No one would have known. Hayes paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the snowy landscape beyond. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and Abigail thought he might leave without responding. Saw tracks disappearing into the storm, he finally said. Figured whoever made them needed help. He glanced back, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Would have done the same for anyone. After he left, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, absorbing the simple truth of his words. Would have done the same for anyone. In a world that had recently shown her its cruelest face, here was a man who had risked his life for a stranger, expecting nothing in return. She thought of the people of Silver Creek who had turned her away, of Ezra Winters with his cold eyes and colder heart. Then of Pastor Wallace, who had at least tried to help in his limited way. And now this stranger, Jackson Hayes, who had carried her through a blizzard because it was to him the only choice a decent human could make. For the first time since Robert's death, Abigail felt something other than grief or betrayal. Not happiness, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile stirring of hope. That night she slept soundly in the little cabin, the howling wind outside no longer an enemy, but merely the voice of a winter that could not touch her now. The following days established a rhythm to life at Evergreen Ranch. True to her word, Abigail insisted on working to earn her keep. Once her strength returned, she took over much of the cooking from Ruth, whose arthritic hands found relief in the lighter duties Abigail assumed. She mended clothes, helped preserve the last of the fall vegetables, and kept the main house tidy. Hayes himself remained something of a mystery. He rose before dawn each day to tend to the cattle, often not returning until dusk. When present, he spoke little, answering Abigail's attempts at conversation with brief, though not unkind, responses. He took his meals quickly and often retreated to a small room off the main living area that she discovered housed a collection of books. Surprising in this frontier setting. A week after her arrival, Abigail was dusting the shelves in the main room when she noticed the titles of medical texts, works of history, even poetry. Not the collection she would have expected from a cattle rancher in the Wyoming territory. Mr. Hayes has always been a reading man, came Isaiah's voice from the doorway. The elderly black man had the same dignified bearing as his wife, his work-worn hands strong despite his years. These aren't typical ranch books, Abigail observed, running her fingers along the spine of a volume on human anatomy. Isaiah's expression grew thoughtful. Mr. Hayes says books help him forget what can't be forgotten. He didn't elaborate, instead changing the subject. Ruth says supper will be ready soon. Would you mind calling the boss? He's in the north pasture, checking fences. That evening, as they ate Ruth's hearty stew, Abigail found the courage to ask Hayes directly about his unusual library. You have an interest in medicine, Mr. Hayes. He looked up, surprised, briefly crossing his features before the now familiar neutral expression returned. Had an interest once, he replied, returning his attention to his food. My father treated basic ailments. Abigail continued undeterred. As a minister, he often tended to both spiritual and physical needs. He taught me what he knew. Hayes studied her for a moment. Minister's daughter, he said, as though confirming something to himself. That explains it. Explains what? Your manners, your speech, different from most women out here. Abigail wasn't sure if this was criticism or observation. My father believed education was important for everyone, daughters included. Hayes nodded. Smart man. He pushed back from the table. Thank you for the meal. I have accounts to review. He retreated to his book room, effectively ending the conversation. Ruth shot Abigail an apologetic look. Don't take it personal, she said softly. He's been that way since... She stopped herself, glancing toward the closed door. Well, he's just that way now. Later that night, returning to her cabin after helping with the dishes, Abigail paused in the cold, clear air. The storm had passed days ago, leaving a landscape transformed by snow, pristine and beautiful under a nearly full moon. Stars crowded the vast Wyoming sky, more than she had ever seen in town. Movement caught her eye. A solitary figure standing at the edge of the property, looking up at the same stars. Hayes stood motionless, his breath clouding in the frigid air, seemingly impervious to the cold. There was something in his posture that spoke of profound solitude, a man alone with memories only he could see. Without conscious decision, Abigail found herself walking toward him, her boots crunching in the crusted snow. He turned at the sound but didn't seem surprised to see her. Beautiful night, she said, coming to stand beside him, though keeping a proper distance. Hayes nodded, returning his gaze to the heavens. Always liked winter stars best. Clearer. Closer somehow. They stood in silence for several minutes, the cold seeping through Abigail's layers, though she made no move to leave. There was something peaceful in this shared solitude, two people carrying separate griefs, finding momentary respite in the immensity of the night sky. My father used to say that stars were windows, Abigail said finally, her voice soft in the still air. Windows through which those we've lost can look down on us. Hayes was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't respond. Nice thought, he said eventually. Don't believe it myself, but nice. What do you believe, Mr. Hayes? He shifted, uncomfortable with the personal question. Believe in what I can see, touch, fix with my own hands. He glanced at her. No offense to your faith. None taken, Abigail replied. Faith is personal. Another silence fell, not uncomfortable but thoughtful. Finally, Hayes spoke again, his voice different somehow. Less guarded. Your father. He's still living? No, passed 2 years ago. Pneumonia. And your husband, Ruth, mentioned you're widowed. Abigail felt the familiar pang, though duller now. Robert died in a mine collapse a month ago. We'd been married 6 months. Hayes nodded, absorbing this. Sorry. Thank you. Abigail hesitated, then asked, Have you always lived alone, Mr. Hayes, besides Ruth and Isaiah, I mean? His posture stiffened slightly. No, he said, single syllable, closing the door on further questions as surely as if he'd slammed it. He turned toward the house. It's late, cold. You should get inside. Yes, of course. Abigail followed, maintaining distance as they walked back toward the buildings. At the point where their paths would diverge, he to the main house, she to the foreman's cabin, she paused. Thank you for letting me stay, Mr. Hayes. I know it's an imposition. In the moonlight, his expression softened fractionally. Not an imposition. Place feels different. With you here. Before she could decipher what he meant, he added, Good night, Mrs. Winters, and strode away, leaving her to wonder at the man who had saved her life, yet remained a mystery. Inside her cabin, Abigail lit the lamp and stoked the stove's fire against the deepening cold. As warmth slowly filled the small space, she found herself thinking of the strange conversation beneath the stars. Different. The ranch felt different with her here. Was that good or bad? Hayes hadn't specified, and his tone had been too neutral to guess. As she prepared for bed, Abigail caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror hung by the door. The woman who looked back was both familiar and strange. The same features, but something altered in the eyes. They had seen death now and betrayal and unexpected kindness from strangers. They had seen the vast indifference of a winter storm and the immensity of a star-filled sky. They were the eyes of a woman who was against all odds, still alive, still moving forward one day at a time into an uncertain future. One day at a time, she whispered to her reflection, her father's favorite advice when problems seemed insurmountable. That's all any of us can do. With that thought, she extinguished the lamp and slipped beneath the blankets, listening to the winter wind outside her snug shelter. grateful for the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place. December deepened, and with it came more snow and temperatures that froze breath the moment it left one's lungs. Abigail found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life, her days filled with practical tasks that left little time for dwelling on the past. She learned that Evergreen Ranch was unusual in several respects. Most ranchers brought their cattle down from the high pastures for winter, keeping them close to barns and feeding grounds. Hayes, however, practiced a different method in allowing most of his smaller herd to winter in sheltered valleys, where natural springs kept grass accessible beneath the snow. Only the weakest animals were kept in the barn, tended daily with extra feed and care. Learned it from the Indians, Isaiah explained as he and Abigail carried water to the pen cattle one morning. Mr. Hayes spent time with the Shoshone years back. They taught him how the buffalo survive winter without human help. It seems to work, Abigail observed, watching the healthy animals. Isaiah nodded. Most ranchers around here think he's crazy, but his cattle survive winter better than most, and he doesn't lose half his hay stores keeping them alive. This was typical of what Abigail was learning about Jackson Hayes. He did things his own way regardless of convention or gossip. It explained why he was willing to house a widow with no questions asked and no concern for what others might think. It also explained why Ruth and Isaiah were treated as equals rather than servants. Abigail had noticed how Hayes consulted Isaiah on ranch matters, deferring to his experience, and how he spoke to Ruth with the same respect he might show any lady regardless of color. In many ways, they functioned more as family than employer and employees. Yet there remained mysteries. Twice now, Abigail had woken in the night to hear Hayes pacing in the main house, his footsteps heavy across the wooden floors. Once she had distinctly heard him cry out a name, Elizabeth. The anguish in his voice so raw it had brought tears to her own eyes. She had not mentioned these episodes respecting his privacy as he respected hers. But curiosity and concern mingled as she observed the shadows beneath his eyes, some mornings the way his hands sometimes trembled slightly before he clenched them into fists. 2 weeks after her arrival, Hayes announced he needed to ride into the nearest town for supplies before the next storm hit. "You're welcome to come," he told Abigail over breakfast. "Mrs. Simmons runs the general store. Might have fabric things you need." He glanced at her worn dress, which she had mended several times already. Abigail hesitated. The prospect of fresh supplies was tempting, but there was risk in being seen with Hayes. Even in a different town, gossip traveled fast in Wyoming territory. Reading her thoughts, Hayes added, "Town small, 10 families at most. Mrs. Simmons is a widow herself, won't judge. Could use some things only a woman would know to select." Ruth nodded encouragingly from the stove. "Go on, child. Do you good to see something besides these four walls and snow?" So it was decided. Hayes hitched his strongest team to a sturdy wagon, loading it with goods to trade, smoked meat hides, and wooden items Isaiah had carved. Abigail bundled in every layer she possessed, plus a heavy coat Hayes insisted she borrow, sat beside him on the wagon seat as they set off through the glistening landscape. They traveled in companionable silence for the first hour, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady breathing of the horses. Hayes handled the team with quiet confidence, his gloved hands strong on the reins. Abigail found herself studying him surreptitiously. The sharp profile against the winter sky, the scar that ran down his left cheek, the lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he had once smiled more often than he did now. "How did you get that scar?" she asked, breaking the silence. "If you don't mind my asking." Hayes glanced at her, seeming to weigh whether to answer. "Chancellorsville," he said finally. "Confederate cavalry charge. Got separated from my unit." "You fought in the war," Abigail said, putting together pieces of what she knew. "Ruth mentioned you were a major." He nodded. "Union Army, 2nd Cavalry. That's how you met Ruth and Isaiah. Found them hiding in a barn after their plantation master fled. They'd been beaten for trying to follow Union lines. Isaiah could barely walk." His jaw tightened at the memory. "Took them with my unit. After the war, offered them work. Free work for free people." "That was honorable," Abigail said softly. Hayes shrugged. Was the right thing to do. Nothing honorable about basic decency. They lapsed into silence again until the small settlement came into view. A cluster of log buildings huddled against the vast wilderness smoke rising from chimneys into the clear blue sky. It was even smaller than Silver Creek, little more than a trading post for the scattered ranches and homesteads in the area. Hayes guided the team to a hitching post outside the largest building, which bore a weather-beaten sign reading, "Simmons General Goods and Post." He helped Abigail down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist, releasing her the moment her feet touched ground. Inside the store was warm and cluttered with everything from tools to fabric to preserved foods. A tall, elderly woman with sharp eyes and iron gray hair, pulled into a severe bun, looked up from behind the counter. "Jackson Hayes," she said, her tone suggesting she didn't often see visitors. "Thought you might be dead in a snowdrift by now." "Not yet, Martha," Hayes replied, a hint of familiarity in his voice. "Got my usual list, plus whatever Mrs. Winters here might need." Martha Simmons' keen eyes assessed Abigail with open curiosity. "Mrs. Winters, is it not from around here?" "No, ma'am," Abigail replied. "I'm from Silver Creek, traveling to Carson City when the storm caught me. Mr. Hayes was kind enough to offer shelter until spring." Something knowing passed through the older woman's eyes, but her expression remained neutral. Silver Creek's had its troubles lately. Heard about that mine collapse. Terrible business. Abigail tensed, wondering how much the woman knew. Yes, it was. Will you look through what I've got? Martha said, gesturing to the shelves. Winter shipments are done, but I keep a good stock. Hayes, your feed order came through last month. Got it in the back. As Hayes followed Martha to a storeroom, Abigail browsed the modest selection of fabrics and notions. She had little money, just what had been in her carpet bag when she fled Silver Creek, but needed at least enough material to make a new dress. Her current garments were showing considerable wear. She was examining a bolt of sturdy cotton when the store's door opened, emitting a blast of cold air, and a man whose appearance made her blood freeze in her veins. Ezra Winters stood in the doorway, his bloodshot eyes widening as they fell on Abigail. For a moment, neither spoke, mutual shock rendering them speechless. Well, Ezra said finally, alcohol evident in his slurred speech, if it isn't my dear sister-in-law. Long way from Silver Creek, aren't you? Abigail's heart hammered in her chest. Ezra, she acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt. I didn't expect to see you here. Didn't expect to see you anywhere, he replied, moving unsteadily toward her. Thought you'd gone to Carson City. That's what the pastor said. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. What are you doing in Hollow Creek? I was caught in the blizzard, Abigail said, taking a step back as he approached. Mr. Hayes offered shelter at his ranch until the road's clear. Ezra's face darkened. Hayes Jackson, Hayes. He laughed an ugly sound. So that's how it is, barely cold in his grave, and you found yourself another man. A rich one this time. It's not like that, Abigail protested, aware of Martha Simmons watching the exchange with sharp interest from behind her counter. Mr. Hayes saved my life. I work for my keep. I'll bet you do, Ezra sneered, the implication clear in his tone. Always knew you were calculating, but this is impressive, even for a preacher's daughter. Anger flared through Abigail's fear. You have no right to speak to me that way. Your brother lied to me, stole from me, and left me with nothing. I owe you nothing, least of all explanations. Ezra's face contorted with rage. He lunged forward, grabbing Abigail's wrist with painful force. You think you're better than him? Than me, you're nothing but a... His words cut off abruptly as a powerful hand clamped onto his shoulder, spinning him around. Jackson Hayes stood there, his gray eyes cold as the winter sky. Take your hand off her, Hayes said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable threat. Ezra released Abigail, but his anger found a new target. This is between me and my brother's widow, Hayes. None of your concern. She's under my protection, Hayes replied evenly. That makes it my concern. Protection, Ezra spat the word. Is that what you call it, taking advantage of a widow woman? Hayes' expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. You're drunk, Winters. Go sleep it off. She didn't tell you, did she? Ezra's mouth twisted into a malicious smile. About how her precious husband died a hero, they called him. He laughed bitterly. Robert didn't die saving just anyone. He died saving Jake Miller, the man he caught with Simmons' wife. Threatened to tell Simmons if Miller didn't pay him to keep quiet. Abigail felt as though she'd been struck. What are you saying? I'm saying your husband died for his pride, not courage, Ezra snarled. He went back for Miller because he couldn't stand the thought of losing his leverage. Wanted to play the big man, always did. And look where it got him. The revelation hit Abigail like a physical blow. Could it be true? Had Robert's final act been one of extortion rather than heroism? It seemed impossible, yet it aligned with the other secrets she had discovered after his death. Hayes stepped between them. That's enough, Winters. Get out before I throw you out. Ezra's eyes darted between Hayes' implacable expression and his obviously strong build. Whatever courage the alcohol had given him began to fade. This isn't over, he muttered, backing toward the door. She's still got no right to the cabin. I'll see to that. After he stumbled out, silence fell in the store. Martha Simmons let out a low whistle. Well, she said, that was more excitement than Hollow Creek's seen in months. Hayes turned to Abigail, concern evident beneath his controlled expression. You all right? She nodded, though she felt anything but. Her mind reeled with Ezra's revelation, trying to reconcile it with the husband she thought she had known. I'm fine, she managed. Can we finish our business and go? Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded, respecting her obvious desire for privacy. He turned to Martha. We'll take what we came for and be on our way. The older woman began gathering their supplies efficiently. Winters has been drinking at Ferguson's place for 2 days, she commented. Running up debts he can't pay. Word is he's nearly lost everything to cards and drink since his brother died. Abigail barely heard her thoughts, a chaotic tumult. She moved through the rest of their transactions, mechanically selecting the minimum she needed, unable to focus on anything but Ezra's words echoing in her mind. The journey back to Evergreen Ranch passed in silence. Hayes didn't press her to speak, seeming to understand her need to process what had happened. The winter landscape blurred before Abigail's eyes as she struggled with this new piece of the puzzle that had been her husband. If what Ezra said was true, and despite his cruelty she had no reason to think he would invent such a specific lie, then everything about Robert's death took on a different meaning. Not a selfless hero, but a man trying to protect a secret scheme of blackmail. It tainted even the grief she had felt, while making her question every memory, every moment of their brief marriage. As the ranch came into view, Hayes finally spoke. People do complicated things for complicated reasons, he said, his eyes on the road ahead. Doesn't make them all good or all bad. Abigail looked at him, surprised by this insight into her thoughts. How can I reconcile the man I thought I married with what I've learned? Hayes was quiet for a moment. You can't, he said finally. Not completely, just have to accept that people are broken. All of us, in different ways. He glanced at her. Doesn't mean there wasn't good in him too. The simple wisdom in his words penetrated Abigail's confusion. She thought of Robert's genuine smile when he brought her wildflowers, his patience teaching her to fish the gentle way he had held her at night. Those things had been real, even if they existed alongside secrets and lies. Thank you, she said softly as Hayes brought the wagon to a stop before the main house. For intervening and for understanding. He nodded once the barest acknowledgement. Your past is your business. But while you're here, you're safe. My word on that. As Isaiah came to help unload the wagon, Abigail retreated to her cabin, needing solitude to process the day's revelations. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the small fire in the stove, trying to make peace with the complex contradictory truths about the man she had married. Outside, snow began falling again, soft flakes drifting past her window in the gathering dusk. Winter had barely begun, and already the world she had known had been utterly transformed. By loss, by betrayal, by unexpected kindness. What more changes would come before the spring thaw allowed her to continue her journey? She thought of Jackson Hayes, the enigmatic man who had saved her life and now offered protection without demands. A man with his own mysteries, his own night terrors calling out a woman's name. Elizabeth. Who had she been to him? Wife, sister, lover, and what had happened to put that haunted look in his eyes? As darkness fell completely, Abigail lit her lamp and opened her father's Bible, seeking comfort in its familiar passages. Her fingers found Ecclesiastes almost by instinct. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. Perhaps this winter at our Evergreen Ranch was her season of healing, of gathering strength for whatever lay ahead. Perhaps like the land beneath its blanket of snow, she too was being prepared for an eventual rebirth. With that thought, she closed the Bible and prepared for bed, listening to the soft shush of snow against her window, nature's gentle reminder that even the harshest winter eventually yields to spring. The week following their encounter with Ezra in Hollow Creek passed quietly. Outside, the snow continued to accumulate, drifting against the buildings of Evergreen Ranch, transforming the landscape into undulating waves of white. Inside, Abigail threw herself into work with renewed determination, as though physical labor could somehow clarify the confusion in her heart. She rose before dawn each day, kindling fires in both her cabin and the main house before Ruth and Isaiah arrived. She baked bread, mended clothing, and even helped Isaiah repair harnesses in the barn, her nimble fingers proving adept at the leatherwork. If Hayes noticed her increased industry, he made no comment, though she sometimes caught him watching her with an unreadable expression. They had settled into a strange sort of domestic arrangement, taking most meals together in the main house, working alongside one another during daylight hours, retreating to separate spaces as darkness fell. The routine provided a comforting structure, yet beneath it lay unspoken currents neither seemed willing to address. Abigail had not mentioned Ezra's revelations about Robert again, choosing instead to process her thoughts privately. Hayes, true to form, respected her silence, never prying into matters she didn't volunteer. Yet his quiet presence offered its own kind of comfort, the certainty that whatever storms raged within her, she faced them in a place of physical safety. 10 days after their trip to town, Abigail was hanging laundry to dry near the kitchen stove when she noticed Hayes's coat had torn along one seam. Without thinking, she took it down to mend before he could notice. As she turned the heavy garment to access the tear, something fell from an inner pocket, a folded piece of paper that fluttered to the floor. Abigail hesitated, her conscience warring with curiosity. The paper had fallen open slightly, revealing handwriting, a letter of some kind. Privacy dictated she simply return it to the pocket unread. Yet something in the visible words caught her attention. The salutation read, "My dearest Elizabeth." Before she could decide what to do, Ruth entered the kitchen, pausing when she saw the paper in Abigail's hand. "Found that, did you?" the older woman asked, her voice carefully neutral. "It fell from Mr. Hayes' coat," Abigail explained quickly. "I was about to put it back." Ruth sighed, setting down her basket of vegetables. "He writes them every month," she said. "Has done for years now, never sends them, though." "Who is Elizabeth?" Abigail asked, unable to contain the question that had nagged at her since hearing Hayes call the name in his sleep. Ruth's weathered face softened with old sorrow. "His wife," she said simply. "She and their old boy Nathan died while the master was away fighting. House fire. Spring of '64. The revelation settled over Abigail like a physical weight. "He was married," she said softly. Not a question, but an acknowledgement of this piece of the puzzle that was Jackson Hayes. 8 years, Ruth confirmed. Happiest years of his life, I expect. He was different then. Smiled more. talked more. She shook her head slightly. Fire changed in everything. By the time we got word to him on the battlefield, they'd been buried 3 weeks. He came back like a different man. He blames himself, Abigail said, understanding now the torment she sometimes heard in his nighttime pacing. War took him away, Ruth agreed. Left them unprotected. That's how he sees it, though. There was nothing he could have done. Fire started in the night, spread too fast. She gestured toward the letter. Best put that back before he notices. He's private about his ghost. Abigail carefully refolded the letter and slipped it back into the coat pocket, her mind processing this new information. Hayes, like herself, carried grief's invisible burden. His isolation, his terse manner, his nightmares, all made sense now in the context of this devastating loss. That evening, as they sat at dinner, Abigail found herself studying Hayes with new awareness. The lines etched at the corners of his eyes, the silver threaded through his dark hair, the vigilant way he surveyed his surroundings. All spoke of a man who had learned that happiness could be snatched away in an instant. Yet he had not become cruel or bitter. Instead, he had channeled his pain into creating this haven, this place where Ruth and Isaiah could live in dignity, where a desperate widow could find shelter without judgment. Something wrong with the stew? Hayes asked, noticing her distraction. No, Abigail replied quickly. It's fine, I was just thinking. He nodded, accepting her vague answer without pressing further. As he returned to his meal, Abigail made a silent resolution. She would not mention what she had learned. His pain was his own, just as hers belonged to her. But perhaps in this shared silence there could be understanding. After dinner, Hayes surprised her by not immediately retreating to his bookroom, as was his custom. Instead, he lingered at the table, seemingly on the verge of speech. Mrs. Winters, he said finally, Isaiah mentioned you have some knowledge of medicine. Basic skills, Abigail clarified. My father believed in practical education. I can treat minor wounds, recognize common illnesses, assist with a childbirth in emergencies. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Riders came through yesterday while you were doing wash. Brought news of sickness at the Wilson's place 10 miles north. 4 children down with high fevers. Concern immediately replaced Abigail's confusion at this unexpected topic. Scarlet fever, diphtheria. Don't know, Hayes admitted. Thought I might ride out tomorrow, see if they need help. If you're willing, could use your knowledge. The request surprised her. Of course I'll help, but surely there's a doctor in Hollow Creek. Doc Jenkins died last spring. Nearest physician is in Rawlins, unreachable until thaw. His expression remained neutral, but Abigail sensed urgency beneath his controlled exterior. Don't want to pressure you. Could be contagious. I've nursed fever patients before, Abigail said firmly. I'll come with you. Relief flickered briefly across Hayes' face. We'll leave at first light. Bring warm clothes. It's a hard ride. True to his word, Hayes was waiting with saddled horses when Abigail emerged from her cabin the next morning, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten. The air was bitterly cold, their breath forming frozen clouds with each exhalation. Hayes had provided her with his warmest spare coat, fur-lined gloves, and a woolen scarf to wrap around her face. Ever ridden before? He asked, helping her mount a sturdy chestnut mare. Some, Abigail replied, not recently. Hayes adjusted her stirrups with efficient movements. Daisy's gentle. Follow my lead. Let me know if you need to rest. The journey proved challenging but exhilarating. They rode through pristine landscape, the sun gradually rising to cast long blue shadows across the snow-covered terrain. Hayes set a steady pace, occasionally glancing back to ensure Abigail was managing. Despite the cold seeping through her layers and the unfamiliar ache of muscles long unused to riding, she found herself enjoying the wild beauty surrounding them. Mid-morning, they crested a rise to see a small homestead nestled in a protected valley below. A log cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, a barn, and several outbuildings all half buried in snow. Wilson Place, Hayes said, urging his horse forward. The scene that greeted them inside the cabin was one of quiet desperation. Mary Wilson, a young mother with exhaustion etched into every line of her face, cared for 4 feverish children, while her husband Thomas maintained a constant rotation of cold compresses, firewood, and water. Mr. Hayes, Mary said, relief evident in her voice. Thank God you've come. Brought help? Hayes replied, gesturing to Abigail. Mrs. Winters has medical knowledge. Abigail immediately moved to the nearest child, a girl of perhaps 6, whose flushed face and labored breathing spoke of serious illness. She placed a gentle hand on the child's forehead, feeling the dangerous heat radiating from her skin. How long have they been ill? She asked, already examining the girl's throat for the telltale signs of diphtheria. 3 days, Thomas Wilson replied, his voice rough with worry. Started with Ellen here, then spread to the others. The baby's the worst off now. Abigail moved systematically from child to child, her father's teachings coming back with practiced clarity. No white patches in their throats ruling out diphtheria, no distinctive rash of scarlet fever. Instead, all 4 showed similar symptoms: high fever, congestion, cough, and in the youngest, an 18-month-old boy, troubling signs of respiratory distress. Influenza, I think, she told the anxious parents. Dangerous but treatable with proper care. She turned to Hayes. We'll need willow bark for the fever, honey for the cough, and something to create steam for their breathing. To her surprise, Hayes nodded immediately. Have willow bark in my saddlebag. Use it for horse fever sometimes. Wilson's Keep bees should have honey. For the next several hours, Abigail directed a coordinated effort to bring the children's fevers down. She showed Mary how to create a steam tent using blankets and hot water infused with pine needles to ease congestion. Hayes and Thomas took turns collecting fresh snow to cool the children's overheated bodies, while Abigail prepared willow bark tea sweetened with honey. The baby concerned her most, his tiny chest heaving with each labored breath, his lips taking on a faintly bluish tinge. Abigail held him semi-upright against her shoulder, patting his back rhythmically to loosen the congestion. Come on, little one, she murmured. Breathe for me. She was so focused on the child that she barely noticed Hayes watching her from across the room, an unreadable expression on his face. When she glanced up and caught his eye, he quickly turned away, busying himself with stoking the fire. By evening, the older children's fevers had begun to break, but the baby remained critical. Abigail refused to leave his side, sending the exhausted mother to rest for a few hours, while she continued the steam treatments and cooling compresses. We'll stay the night, Hayes told Thomas. Continue treatment till morning. Abigail shot him a grateful look, relieved she wouldn't have to choose between the sick children and returning to the ranch. As midnight approached, the cabin grew quiet. Thomas and Mary had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping on pallets near their children. Hayes sat by the fire, keeping it burning steadily against the deepening cold outside. Abigail remained in a rocking chair, the baby dozing fitfully against her chest, his breathing still labored but slightly improved. You're good with them, Hayes said softly, breaking the long silence. The children. Abigail smiled faintly. My father often cared for sick children in our parish. I learned by helping him. She looked down at the sleeping infant. There's something about a child's trust that humbles you. They don't question whether you're capable or worthy. They simply accept the comfort offered. Hayes nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice so low she almost missed the words. Had a son once. Would have been 15 this year. The simple statement, offered without preamble, caught Abigail off guard. She kept her expression neutral, not wanting to betray that Ruth had already shared this information. What was his name? She asked gently. Nathan. A muscle worked in Hayes's jaw. Good boy, smart, always asking questions about everything. Wanted to be a doctor like... He stopped abruptly. Like his father, Abigail finished, understanding dawning. The medical books in Hayes's library, his knowledge of treatments, the clinical way he had assessed her condition when she first arrived. Hayes met her gaze, something like resignation in his eyes. I was a surgeon. Army trained me. Before that, medical school in Boston. You were a doctor, Abigail said, pieces falling into place. During the war. He nodded once. Field surgeon, 2nd Cavalry. His expression darkened. Saw things no man should see. Did things no man should have to do. Amputations in field hospitals with no chloroform. Boys younger than Nathan crying for their mothers while I cut off what was left of their legs. The raw pain in his voice made Abigail's heart ache. That's why you left medicine behind. Left it behind when I couldn't save my own. Hayes said, his voice flat. What kind of doctor loses his wife and child to fever and fire while he's 1,000 miles away cutting up other men's sons? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Abigail understood now the full weight of the guilt Hayes carried. Not just a husband who had failed to protect his family, but a doctor who had failed to heal them. I'm so sorry, she said simply, knowing no words could truly comfort such profound loss. Hayes shook his head slightly, as though brushing away her sympathy. Long time ago now. He stood, adding wood to the fire. Should try to sleep. Children will need tending come morning. But Abigail sensed he had more to say, that having opened this door to his past, he stood uncertainly on the threshold. Robert died trying to save someone, she said, offering her own pain in exchange. I thought it was heroism. Turns out it was something far more complicated. Hayes settled back into his chair, listening. His brother told me Robert had caught a man named Jake Miller with another man's wife. Abigail continued, the words coming easier in the firelit darkness. He was blackmailing Miller. When the mine collapsed, he went back for him, not out of courage, but to protect his source of income. She looked down at the sleeping baby. I don't know what's worse, learning my husband was capable of such things, or realizing I never truly knew him at all. People surprise you, Hayes said after a moment. Good and bad. Man can be brave and cowardly, honest and deceitful all at once. How do you reconcile that? Abigail asked. How do you make peace with loving someone who wasn't who you thought they were? Hayes considered this, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. Don't think you do. Not completely. Just accept that loving someone doesn't make them perfect, and their failings don't erase what was good. The simple wisdom of his words settled over Abigail like a balm. She thought of Robert, his genuine joy, when he presented her with the small cabin he'd built, his patience teaching her to fish the tenderness in his touch. Those things had been real, even if they existed alongside deception and moral compromise. Thank you, she said softly. Hayes nodded, then changed the subject. Baby's breathing easier. Abigail listened to the infant's respiration, noticing the reduced wheezing. Yes, I think the worst has passed. She shifted the child slightly, easing her cramped arms. Would you mind holding him for a moment? I need to prepare more willow bark tea for when he wakes. Hayes hesitated, something like apprehension crossing his features. Then with careful movements, he rose and took the baby from her arms. The contrast was striking, the large, weathered hands cradling the tiny form with unexpected gentleness. For a moment, Abigail glimpsed the man Hayes might have been in another life. The father, the healer before war and tragedy had reshaped him. As she prepared the medicinal tea, she watched Hayes from the corner of her eye. He held the child with practiced ease, one large hand supporting the baby's head, the other patting his back rhythmically. When the infant fussed slightly, Hayes began to hum, a low, almost imperceptible melody that nevertheless seemed to soothe the child back to sleep. Something shifted in Abigail's perception in that moment. The stern, solitary rancher revealed himself as something more complex, a man who remembered how to comfort a child who still carried the healer's instinct beneath layers of grief and self-imposed isolation. By morning, all four Wilson children showed marked improvement. The baby's fever had broken during the night, and his breathing had eased considerably. The older children were awake and even asking for food, a promising sign. Don't know how to thank you, Thomas Wilson said as they prepared to depart. If you hadn't come, any neighbor would have done the same, Hayes replied, uncomfortable, with gratitude as always. Mary Wilson pressed a jar of honey into Abigail's hands. For your kindness, she insisted. And perhaps, could you write down those treatments? In case the fever returns. Abigail spent a few minutes instructing Mary on continued care, promising to check on them again in a week if weather permitted. As they mounted their horses for the journey home, she noticed Hayes watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. You did good work, he said as they rode away from the homestead. Saved that baby's life. We both did, Abigail corrected. I couldn't have managed alone. Hayes shook his head slightly. Been a long time since I helped anyone heal. A pause then felt right. The admission, simple as it was, seemed significant coming from this reticent man. Abigail sensed that in helping the Wilson children, something had awakened in Hayes. Some part of himself he had buried alongside his family. They rode in companionable silence for several miles, the winter landscape glittering around them in the morning sun. Despite the cold and physical exertion, Abigail felt a curious lightness. For the first time since Robert's death, she had a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. She had helped save lives, used her knowledge for good. It was a small redemption, but a meaningful one. The snow's getting deeper, Hayes observed as they navigated a particularly challenging stretch. Another storm coming, I'd guess. Need to check the high pasture cattle before it hits. Abigail nodded, understanding this was his way of shifting back to practical matters after the emotional terrain they had traversed. I'll help Ruth prepare extra supplies. If it's a bad one, we might be truly snowbound for days. Hayes glanced at her. Managing all right? Being stuck at the ranch all winter. The question surprised her. Yes, she replied honestly. It's not what I expected, but she searched for the right words. There's peace there. Purpose. Something that might have been satisfaction flickered in Hayes' eyes, but he said nothing more as they continued their journey homeward. The storm Hayes predicted arrived with a vengeance the following day. Wind howled around the buildings of Evergreen Ranch, driving snow into drifts that soon reached the windowsills. All outdoor activity became impossible, confining the ranch's inhabitants to the main house, where the largest fireplace offered the best defense against the plummeting temperatures. Ruth set up a temporary bed for Abigail in a small side room, insisting she not risk the dangerous 50-yard trek to the foreman's cabin until the blizzard passed. Isaiah brought in extra firewood, stacking it high against the kitchen wall. Hayes moved restlessly between windows, checking the storm's progress, occasionally venturing to the barn to ensure the animals remained safe and warm. By evening, the full fury of the blizzard had descended. The wind's howl transformed into an unearthly shriek, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the sturdy log walls. Despite the roaring fire-cold drafts snaked across the floor, Ruth served a hearty stew, its warmth a welcome comfort against the storm's assault. Worst one I've seen in years, Isaiah commented, rubbing his arthritic hands near the flames. Reminds me of the winter of '69. Lost half the cattle that year. Different now, Hayes replied. Cattle are in the sheltered valleys. They'll hunker down, survive on what they can dig out. He glanced at Abigail. You warm enough? She nodded, touched by his concern. The fire helps, and Ruth's stew. Master always worries, Ruth said with a knowing smile. About everyone but himself. Hayes shot her a look that might have been annoyance but carried no real heat. Just practical. Can't afford anyone getting sick. After dinner, rather than retreating to separate areas of the house as they might normally have done, the storm's intensity kept them gathered near the fire. Isaiah carved a piece of wood with skilled hands, the shavings curling into the flames. Ruth mended by lamplight, her needle flashing steadily. Hayes surprisingly remained with them, rather than seeking solitude in his bookroom. Abigail had brought her father's Bible and was reading quietly when Hayes spoke. Your father, he said, breaking the comfortable silence. He was a preacher. Abigail looked up, surprised by the personal question. Yes, Methodist minister in a small parish outside Cheyenne. He came west as a missionary originally, then settled when he married my mother. She passed young, Hayes asked, correctly reading between the lines. Childbirth, Abigail confirmed. I never knew her. Father raised me alone. She smiled faintly at the memory. He was unconventional. Believed a girl should know scripture and Shakespeare equally well. Taught me to read, write, calculate, and treat basic ailments. Said a minister's daughter needed practical skills as well as spiritual ones. Wise man, Hayes commented. Most girls get taught to sew and look pretty. Not much use out here. He wanted me to be independent, Abigail said, though I don't think he imagined the circumstances I'd need those skills for. She paused, then added softly, he would have liked you, I think. Hayes raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You're a man of action rather than words, Abigail explained. Father always said true character shows in deeds, not speeches. He distrusted flowery preachers who talked of charity, but practiced none. The corner of Hayes's mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it she had yet seen. Your father sounds like a rare sort of minister. He was, Abigail agreed. Too practical for some of his congregation, too spiritual for others, but true to himself always. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence again, broken only by the storm's continued assault outside and the occasional pop from the fireplace. There was something intimate about being gathered together against nature's fury, a reminder of humanity's fundamental vulnerability and interdependence. As the evening progressed, Ruth and Isaiah eventually retired to their quarters off the kitchen, leaving Abigail and Hayes alone by the fire. Abigail expected him to withdraw as well, but he remained stoking the flames occasionally, seemingly content with the quiet companionship. Should check the barn once more before turning in, he said, finally rising from his chair. Make sure the horses are settled. Is it safe? Abigail asked, concerned by the storm's undiminished ferocity. Got a guide rope strung between house and barn, Hayes explained. Hold on to it, can't get lost, even in a whiteout. He shrugged into his heavy coat. Won't be long. After he left, Abigail moved to the window, trying to peer through the swirling snow. She could see nothing but white darkness, the barn completely obscured despite being barely 30 yards away. The thought of Hayes navigating through that blinding storm sent a surprising pang of worry through her chest. Relief washed over her when the door finally opened again, several minutes later, admitting Hayes in a blast of frigid air. Snow crusted his beard and coat, immediately beginning to melt in the cabin's warmth. Animals are fine, he reported, stamping his boots and hanging his coat by the fire. Storm's not letting up, though. Might last through tomorrow. At least we're all safe inside, Abigail said, returning to her place by the fire. Hayes nodded, remaining standing, seemingly uncertain whether to join her or retreat to his room. Something in his hesitation emboldened Abigail. Would you like me to read aloud for a while? She offered. My father and I used to read to each other during storms. It helps pass the time. Hayes considered this, then sat in the chair opposite hers. Been a while since anyone read to me, he admitted. Must since, well, he stopped, but Abigail understood. Not since Elizabeth. I could read from the Bible, Abigail suggested. Or, do you have another preference? To her surprise, Hayes rose and went to his bookroom, returning with a volume of poetry. Elizabeth's favorite, he said, offering it to her. Wordsworth. The gesture touched Abigail deeply. This was no small thing. To share something so personal, so connected to his lost wife. She accepted the book with care, opening to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey. She read, glancing up at Hayes. A favorite. He nodded, settling back into his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. She read it often, said it reminded her that beauty remains even after suffering. Abigail began to read, her voice soft but clear against the storm's backdrop. The poem spoke of nature's power to heal the human spirit, to connect one to something larger than individual suffering. As she read, she noticed Hayes gradually relaxing, his eyes closing, not in sleep, but in something like remembrance. When she finished, silence filled the room, broken only by the fire's gentle crackling and the storm's muffled howl. Neither spoke for several minutes, allowing the poem's beauty to linger between them. Thank you, Hayes said finally, his voice rough with emotion he clearly struggled to contain. Would you like me to read another? Abigail asked gently. He shook his head. Enough for tonight. He stood, his movements suddenly stiff, as though he regretted the moment of vulnerability. You should rest. Room at the end of the hall is prepared for you. Good night then, Abigail said, understanding his need to withdraw. And thank you for sharing this. She held up the poetry volume. Hayes nodded once, then disappeared down the hallway, leaving Abigail alone with the dying fire and the howling storm. She remained there a while longer, turning the book in her hands, feeling the weight of the memories it carried. In sharing this small piece of his past, Hayes had crossed some invisible boundary between them. Not a dramatic gesture, but significant nonetheless for a man who guarded his pain so carefully. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the storm's continued rage, Abigail found herself thinking of the two men who had shaped her recent life so profoundly. Robert, with his easy charm and hidden secrets, who had brought her west with promises that had died with him. And now Hayes, taciturn, wounded, yet possessed of a fundamental decency that showed itself in actions rather than words. Two more different men would be hard to imagine. Yet both had awakened feelings in her, one of romantic love that had ended in grief and disillusionment. The other, a more complex emotion she hesitated to name. Respect certainly, gratitude without question, but also something else. A recognition of kindred suffering, perhaps. A sense that beneath their obvious differences lay similar wounds. Outside, the blizzard continued unabated, sealing them all within this temporary sanctuary. Yet even as the storm isolated them from the outside world, Abigail sensed it was drawing them closer to each other in ways none of them had anticipated. So, the blizzard raged for 3 days, finally releasing its grip on the fourth morning when Abigail awoke to unaccustomed silence. The wind's howl had ceased, replaced by a stillness that seemed almost as loud after the storm's constant roar. Sunlight streamed through frosted windows as she made her way to the kitchen, where Ruth already had coffee brewing on the stove. "Storm's past," the older woman announced unnecessarily. "Isaiah says he ain't never seen such snow, though. Drifts higher than a man's head in some places." Through the window, Abigail could see Hayes and Isaiah already at work shoveling paths between the buildings. The snow gleamed blindingly white in the morning sun, pristine except for their tracks. "Barn roof held," Ruth continued, setting a mug of coffee before Abigail. "Animals all survived. Mr. Hayes is worried about the cattle in the high pastures, though. Says he needs to ride out today, make sure they can reach the streams." "In this snow, Barry?" Abigail asked, concerned. Ruth nodded. "Man never rests. Isaiah says he's been like that since he lost his family. Like standing still might kill them." The observation struck Abigail as profoundly insightful. She had noticed Hayes's constant activity, his restless checking and rechecking of the ranch's operations. Perhaps it was indeed a way of outrunning grief, or at least keeping it at arm's length through sheer exhaustion. After breakfast, Abigail returned to the foreman's cabin, now accessible via the path Hayes had cleared. She was gathering clean clothes when a knock came at her door. Hayes himself, his beard and eyebrows still crusted with snow from his morning labors. "Riding out to check the north herd," he said without preamble. "Thought you might want to come, after being cooped up for days." The invitation surprised her. "Won't it be dangerous?" "Storm's past, sun's strong today, not as cold." He shrugged. "Understand if you'd rather stay." "No," Abigail said quickly, realizing she did indeed crave fresh air and open space after the storm's confinement. "I'd like to come. Give me a few minutes to dress properly." Hayes nodded. "Meet at the barn when you are ready." 30 minutes later, they rode away from the ranch, following a ridge that offered the most manageable path through the deep snow. Hayes led on his sturdy black gelding, occasionally looking back to ensure Abigail was managing the challenging terrain. She had become more comfortable on horseback during her weeks at Evergreen, though today's conditions tested her improved skills. The landscape that unfolded around them was breathtaking. Vast expanses of untouched snow glittering beneath the winter sun, occasional stands of pine trees laden with white distant mountains, sharp against the clear blue sky. After days confined indoors, the sheer openness felt like freedom. They rode in companionable silence for nearly an hour before Hayes reined in atop a rise overlooking a sheltered valley. Below, dark shapes moved against the white, cattle seeking forage near a stream that remained partially unfrozen. "They've survived," Hayes said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Found the water just like I taught them." "You taught cattle?" Abigail asked, unable to hide her amusement at the phrasing. The corner of Hayes's mouth lifted slightly. "Trained them, I suppose. Brought them to this spot repeatedly in better weather. Animals remember where they've found water before." He surveyed the herd with a practiced eye. "Might lose a few of the weaker ones before spring, but most will make it." As they watched, a movement at the valley's far end caught their attention. A small herd of elk moving gracefully through the deep snow, their breath clouding in the cold air. "Oh," Abigail breathed, entranced by the wild beauty of the scene. "Nature finds a way," Hayes said quietly, "no matter how harsh the winter." They sat their horses in silence for several minutes, observing the intermingled cattle and elk sharing the precious water source. There was something profound in the moment, a reminder of life's persistence, even in the most challenging conditions. Eventually, Hayes turned his horse. "Should head back. Daylight doesn't last long this time of year." As they began their return journey, Abigail found herself reluctant to leave this peaceful scene behind. "Thank you for bringing me," she said. "It's beautiful out here." Hayes nodded. "Different kind of church," he observed, "but sacred in its own way." The comment surprised her, coming from a man who had earlier expressed skepticism about faith. Before she could respond, Hayes continued, "Your father saw God in Scripture. I see something in this." He gestured to the vast landscape. "Don't know if it's the same thing, but it feels—" He struggled for words, unused to expressing such thoughts. "Larger than us, than our troubles." "I think my father would have agreed with you," Abigail said softly. "He often said God speaks through nature as clearly as through the Bible." Hayes considered this. "Man sounds wiser than most preachers I've known." They continued riding the conversation, shifting to more practical matters. Preparations needed for the remaining winter months, repairs to be made once the snow receded, plans for spring planting. Yet Abigail sensed something had shifted between them during this outing. Hayes spoke more freely occasionally, offering observations or even memories that revealed glimpses of the man beneath the stern exterior. As they approached the ranch, the sun already sinking toward the western horizon, Hayes suddenly reined in his horse, his posture alert. Abigail followed his gaze to see fresh tracks in the snow, horse tracks partially filled by the morning's light snowfall. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice tense. During the storm, alarm shot through Abigail. "Ezra!" "Don't know. Tracks lead toward the barn." Hayes urged his horse forward, Abigail following close behind. The main buildings appeared undisturbed as they approached, smoke rising normally from the chimney, no signs of forced entry. Ruth appeared at the door of the main house as they dismounted, her expression worried. "Isaiah found tracks by the north fence," she reported. "Someone was scouting the property. Didn't come to the door, just circled around." Hayes's face hardened. "When?" "Must have been last night or early morning. Fresh snows partly filled them in." Hayes handed his reins to Abigail. "Take the horses to the barn. I'll check the perimeter." For the rest of the evening, an undercurrent of tension ran through the household. Hayes returned from his inspection with no additional information, but his vigilance remained heightened. He checked and loaded his rifle, placing it near the door, and instructed Isaiah to do the same with the shotgun. "Probably nothing," he told Abigail when he caught her worried glance. "Traveler lost in the storm, maybe, but better cautious." Abigail wasn't convinced. The timing seemed too coincidental after their encounter with Ezra in town. She remembered his parting words, "This isn't over," and wondered if he had somehow tracked her to Evergreen Ranch. That night, Abigail found sleep elusive, her mind conjuring scenarios involving Ezra's return. The man had already demonstrated his bitterness and capacity for cruelty. What might he do if truly determined to cause trouble? A soft knock at her cabin door jolted her from these troubling thoughts. Heart racing, she approached cautiously. "Who is it?" "Hayes," came the reply, muffled by the thick wood. Relief flooded her as she opened the door to find him standing in the moonlight, rifle in hand, breath clouding in the frigid air. "Everything all right?" she asked, clutching her shawl around her nightdress. "Fine," he assured her, bro. "Just checking. Going to patrol the property every few hours tonight." He hesitated, then added, "Wanted to make sure you felt safe." The gesture touched her deeply. "Thank you. I'm fine, really." Hayes nodded, his eyes scanning the snowy landscape beyond her cabin. "Lock your door. Keep a lamp burning if it helps you sleep. I'll be within shouting distance all night." As he turned to go, Abigail called softly after him. "Mr. Hayes." He paused, looking back. "Please be careful." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her concern for his welfare. "Always am," he replied, then disappeared into the darkness. Abigail returned to bed, somehow comforted despite the potential threat. Hayes's protection offered more than physical security. It provided an emotional anchor as well. Whatever danger might lurk beyond the ranch's boundaries, she was not facing it alone. With that thought warming her more effectively than the blankets, she finally drifted into sleep. January gave way to February, bringing slightly longer days, but no respite from winter's grip. The mysterious visitor did not return, or at least left no further evidence of their presence, in allowing the tension at Evergreen Ranch to gradually ease. Abigail's life had settled into a rhythm that, while temporary, nevertheless offered a sense of purpose she had not experienced since Robert's death. Her days were filled with productive work alongside Ruth and Isaiah, her evenings often spent in the main house where increasingly Hayes joined them, rather than retreating to solitude. The change in him was subtle but unmistakable. He spoke more occasionally, even initiating conversations. Once or twice, Abigail had glimpsed what might have been a smile, a brief softening of his stern features in response to some comment of hers. Most telling was his willingness to share small pieces of his past, memories of Elizabeth and Nathan that seemed to bring both pain and a certain peace in the telling. In turn, Abigail found herself opening up about her own life, her childhood as a minister's daughter, her brief courtship with Robert, even her confused feelings upon discovering his deceptions after death. Hayes listened without judgment, occasionally offering insights that revealed his deep understanding of human complexity. One evening in mid-February, as they sat by the fire after Ruth and Isaiah had retired, Hayes surprised her with an unexpected question. "Will you still go to Carson City when spring comes?" The question caught Abigail off guard. In truth, she had thought less and less about her original plan as winter progressed. The address in Carson City represented safety when she had none, but now, "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I've never met my grandmother. She might not welcome me appearing unannounced." Hayes nodded, his eyes on the flames. "Could stay," he said quietly. "If you wanted. Ranch needs help. Ruth's hands aren't what they used to be, and you've got skills we could use." The offer hung in the air between them, its implications extending beyond mere employment. Abigail felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with practical considerations. "Are you asking me to remain as your employee?" she asked carefully. Hayes looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "As whatever you want to be," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "Don't want to presume. Know you're still grieving. Just, there's a place for you here, if you want it." Before Abigail could formulate a response to this ambiguous but significant offer, a sound from outside interrupted the moment. The distinct crunch of footsteps in snow approaching the house. Hayes was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Stay here," he ordered, moving to the window with practiced stealth. Abigail's heart raced as she watched him peer cautiously through the glass, his body tense with alertness. After a moment, his posture relaxed slightly. "It's Tucker," he said, setting aside the rifle. "Sheriff from Hollow Creek." Relief washed over Abigail, followed immediately by concern. A sheriff arriving unannounced after dark rarely brought good news. Hayes opened the door to admit a tall, weathered man in his 50s, snow crusting his heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat. Nathan Tucker stamped his boots on the threshold, his breath clouding in the cabin's warmth as he removed his hat. "Evening, Hayes," he said, nodding to Abigail. "Ma'am, sorry to disturb you at this hour." "What brings you out in this cold, Tucker?" Hayes asked, his tone suggesting the two men shared some history. Tucker accepted the coffee Hayes offered, warming his hands on the mug before speaking. "Trouble brewing. Thought you should know." He glanced at Abigail. "Involves the lady here indirectly." Abigail tensed. "Is it Ezra Winters?" Tucker nodded. "Man's been drinking heavily at Ferguson's place for weeks now, running up debts he can't pay. Last night got into a card game with Jeremiah Daniels." Hayes' expression darkened at the name. "Daniels is in Hollow Creek. Passing through, he says, on banking business for his father." Tucker's tone suggested skepticism. "Winters lost badly, signed over some property to cover his debts." "What property?" Abigail asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Cabin and land near Silver Creek," Tucker confirmed. "Property that was his brother's. Your late husband's, ma'am." The news shouldn't have hurt. Abigail had already accepted that the cabin was lost to her. Yet something about Ezra gambling it away to a stranger felt like a final desecration of the home she and Robert had briefly shared. "What's this got to do with Hayes?" Tucker continued, his expression grim. "Daniels was asking questions about you, Hayes, about the widow staying here, and about Evergreen Ranch's boundaries." Hayes' jaw tightened. "Still wants this land, does he?" "Seems so. Has been watching the place from what I gather. Those tracks you reported after the big storm, likely his men." Abigail looked between the two men, sensing an old conflict. "Who is Jeremiah Daniels?" Hayes' expression was hard as granite. "Banker's son from Rawlins. Been trying to buy Evergreen for years. His father holds notes on half the ranches in the territory." He turned to Tucker. "What's he planning?" Tucker sighed heavily. "Don't know for certain, but there's talk. Winters has been running his mouth telling anyone who'll listen that his brother's widow is living here in sin. Daniel seems mighty interested in that particular story." Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. Partly embarrassment, partly anger. "That's absurd. Mr. Hayes rescued me from freezing to death. He's been nothing but proper and kind." "No need to explain to me, ma'am," Tucker said gently. "Known Hayes 20 years. Fought alongside him at Antietam. Man's as honorable as they come." He turned back to Hayes. "But Daniels could use such talk to cause trouble. Might be planning something. Thought you should be warned." Hayes nodded. "Appreciate it, Tucker. You ride him back tonight?" "No choice. Got prisoners in the jail, needs watching." Tucker drained his coffee and stood. "Just be vigilant. Daniels is the type to create trouble, then use the law to profit from it." After the sheriff departed, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Abigail found herself trembling slightly, though whether from anger or fear she couldn't quite tell. "I'm so sorry," she said finally. "It seems I've brought danger to your door." Hayes shook his head firmly. "Daniels has wanted this land long before you arrived. Using Ezra Winters and his grudge as an excuse, that's all." He studied her face. "Don't let this change anything. You're safe here." But Abigail wasn't entirely convinced. The peaceful existence they had built at Evergreen suddenly seemed threatened from outside, and she was at least partly the cause. The offer Hayes had made before Tucker's arrival to stay beyond winter now carried additional complications. "Perhaps," she began hesitantly, "perhaps it would be better if I did continue to Carson City when spring comes, to remove any reason for gossip or trouble." Something that might have been pain flickered briefly in Hayes' eyes, quickly masked. "Your decision," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "But don't make it out of fear or misplaced guilt." He moved to stoke the fire, his back to her. "Whatever Daniels is planning, we'll face it. Together. Until you choose otherwise." The simple declaration, "we'll face it together," warmed Abigail more than the fire's renewed blaze. Despite the potential danger, despite the complications of their unusual situation, Hayes was offering not just protection, but partnership. A shared stand against whatever threats might come. As she returned to her cabin that night, Abigail found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated when she first sought refuge from the storm. Ahead lay several possible futures: continuing to Carson City as originally planned, remaining at Evergreen as Hayes' employee, or perhaps something else entirely. Something suggested in the way he had looked at her when offering a place here as whatever you want to be. The choice was hers to make. But for the first time since Robert's death, the future held possibilities rather than just survival. And that in itself felt like the first fragile bloom of hope in winter's deepest chill. February yielded grudgingly to March winter's grip, loosening by imperceptible degrees. The days lengthened, the sun gaining strength, though nights remained bitterly cold. At Evergreen Ranch, routine continued, despite Sheriff Tucker's warning cattle to tend repairs to make meals to prepare. Yet an undercurrent of vigilance ran beneath these ordinary activities. Hayes checked the property boundaries daily. Isaiah kept the shotgun within reach, and even Ruth scanned the horizon whenever she stepped outside. Only Abigail maintained a semblance of normalcy, refusing to let fear dictate her days. Yet she found herself watching Hayes with growing concern, noting the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent patrolling the ranch's perimeter. "You can't keep this up," she told him one morning as he returned from another pre-dawn inspection, exhaustion evident in his movements. "You'll make yourself ill." Hayes shook his head. Had worse during the war. Went 5 days without sleep once marching through Virginia. He accepted the coffee she offered, their fingers brushing briefly. "Besides, spring's coming, snow's melting in the lower pastures, makes us more accessible." "And that worries you," Abigail observed. It wasn't a question. Hayes met her gaze directly. "Daniels isn't a man to make idle threats. If he wants this land, he'll try to take it one way or another." "But why, there must be other properties." Hayes' expression darkened. "It's personal now. Turned him down 3 times over the years. Man like Daniels doesn't handle rejection well." He hesitated, then added, "And there's water. Evergreen has 3 year-round springs that never freeze. Valuable in this territory." Abigail understood then. Water meant survival in Wyoming's harsh climate. Control of water meant power over neighboring ranches and homesteads. "What will you do if he comes?" "Depends what he brings," Hayes replied evenly. "Words I can handle. Trouble." He didn't finish, but his meaning was clear. That afternoon, as Abigail helped Ruth hang laundry to dry in the strengthening sun, she found herself studying the ranch with new eyes. What had seemed simply a refuge now revealed itself as something worth fighting for, not just buildings and land, but a life carefully constructed, a haven for those society often rejected. Ruth and Isaiah, former slaves who here lived with dignity and respect. Hayes himself, a man rebuilding his life from tragedy's ashes. And now her, a widow who had found purpose, where once she saw only desolation. "You're deep in thought," Ruth observed, pinning a shirt to the line. "Just appreciating this place," Abigail replied honestly, understanding why Mr. Hayes protects it so fiercely. Ruth nodded, her weathered face softening. "Built it from nothing, he did. After the war, after losing Elizabeth and the boy. Land was considered worthless then, too far from town, too exposed to weather. But he saw something others didn't." She gestured toward the distant mountains. Said it reminded him of a painting Elizabeth loved. "View of mountains across water." Abigail absorbed this new piece of Hayes' history. He built this place as a memorial to her. "Partly," Ruth agreed, "but also to heal himself. Working the land, building something lasting, it gave him purpose when he had none." She gave Abigail a knowing look. "Same thing he's done for you in a way." Before Abigail could respond to this observation, Isaiah appeared from the direction of the north pasture, his pace unusually hurried. "Riders coming," he announced, his normally calm voice tense. 5 of them following the creek trail. Ruth's hand flew to her throat. "Is it them, Daniels?" "Can't tell yet. Too far." Isaiah turned to Abigail. "Best get inside, Mrs. Winters. I'll fetch the master." But Hayes was already striding toward them from the barn, rifle in hand, alerted by some sixth sense to the approaching threat. "How many?" he asked Isaiah. 5 that I counted, armed." Hayes nodded once, his expression grim but controlled. "Ruth, take Mrs. Winters inside." "No," Abigail said firmly, surprising herself as much as the others. "If this concerns me, and we both know it likely does, I won't hide." Hayes studied her for a moment, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "Stay behind me then," he finally said. "Isaiah, get the shotgun." "Ruth, that pistol I showed you is under my bed, just in case." As Ruth hurried to the house, Hayes positioned himself in the yard, Abigail slightly behind his right shoulder, Isaiah to his left. Together they watched the riders approach 5 men on horseback, emerging from the tree line, moving at a deliberate pace that suggested confidence rather than caution. Abigail recognized Jeremiah Daniels immediately, though she had never met him. He rode at the front, a man in his 30s with the well-fed look of wealth and the cold eyes of someone accustomed to getting his way. Beside him, to Abigail's shock, rode Ezra Winters, his face haggard but his posture belligerent. The other 3 men were strangers, rough-looking characters whose hands rested too casually near their holstered guns. The riders halted their horses at a respectful distance, Daniels raising his hand in a gesture that might have been greeting, but carried an undercurrent of mockery. "Hayes," he called. "Been a while?" "Not long enough," Hayes replied evenly. "You're trespassing, Daniels." Daniels affected a look of surprise. "And my boundaries get confusing in winter. Besides, I'm here on legitimate business." His gaze shifted to Abigail, a smile that didn't reach his eyes spreading across his face. "Mrs. Winters, I presume a pleasure to make your acquaintance." Abigail said nothing, instinctively distrusting this false courtesy. "What business?" Hayes demanded, drawing Daniel's attention back to himself. Property matters, Daniels replied smoothly. As you may know, I recently acquired the deed to a cabin near Silver Creek, formerly belonging to Robert Winters. He gestured toward Ezra, who swayed slightly in his saddle, clearly intoxicated even at this early hour. In reviewing the paperwork, I discovered some irregularities, items that rightfully belong to the property that may have been removed. That's a lie, Abigail said, unable to contain herself. I took nothing that wasn't mine. Daniels raised an eyebrow. That's precisely the matter in question, Mrs. Winters. What was yours versus what belonged to the property? He produced a folded document from his coat. According to this inventory signed by Ezra Winters, several valuable items are missing. Family heirlooms primarily. A silver pocket watch. A particular Bible with a distinctive cover. A wedding band that belonged to the Winters matriarch. Outrage flooded Abigail. The watch was my father's, given to Robert as a wedding gift. The Bible was my father's as well, and I'm wearing my own wedding band, not some family heirloom. Convenient claims, Daniel said with feigned regret, but without documentation to support them. I'm afraid the law would view these items as property assets. Assets now legally mine. Hayes stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. You rode all this way for a watch and a Bible. I'm a businessman, Hayes. Details matter. Daniel's pretense at civility slipped slightly. And when items are stolen from my property, I take it personally. Nothing was stolen, Abigail insisted, and you know it. Daniels ignored her, his attention focused on Hayes. I'm prepared to be reasonable. Return the items and we'll consider the matter closed. Refuse. He shrugged. I'd hate to involve Sheriff Tucker in what should be a simple transaction. The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. False accusations, a questionable sheriff, a woman without resources to defend herself legally, it could end badly regardless of truth. Hayes seemed to consider for a moment, then replied with surprising calm. Tucker won't help you, Daniels. He knows your game. Perhaps, Daniels conceded, but the circuit judge might see things differently, especially when presented with signed affidavits regarding a woman of questionable character, taking up residence with a bachelor rancher. His gaze slid to Abigail, the insinuation unmistakable. Before Hayes could respond, Ezra suddenly spoke, his words slurred with alcohol. Told you she was calculating. Wormed her way into Robert's life. Now yours. Woman's a curse. That's enough, Hayes warned, his hand tightening on his rifle. Is it? Daniels countered smoothly. From what I hear, the good people of Silver Creek consider Mrs. Winters something of a harbinger of misfortune. A mining accident that killed 3 men, including her husband. Now taking up with you under ambiguous circumstances. He smiled thinly. People talk, Hayes, especially about a woman alone. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face, not from fear, but from pure, crystallizing anger. These men sought to use her very existence, her widowhood, her desperate circumstances, her acceptance of Hayes' shelter as weapons. The injustice of it burned through her like wildfire. Are you finished? She asked, stepping forward, despite Hayes' warning glance. Daniels blinked clearly, surprised by her interruption. Pardon? I asked if you're finished, Abigail repeated, her voice steady despite the rage pulsing through her veins. Because if this pathetic display of threats and insinuations is complete, I'd like to respond. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Daniels' face, quickly masked. By all means, Mrs. Winters. Abigail stood straight, drawing on every ounce of dignity her father had instilled in her. You claim to want a watch and a Bible, items of minimal monetary value but significant personal meaning. Yet you arrive with armed men and veiled threats. Your true purpose is transparent, Mr. Daniels. You want this land and you'll use any leverage to get it. She turned to Ezra, whose bloodshot eyes widened at being directly addressed. You sold what wasn't yours to sell Robert's cabin to cover gambling debts. Having squandered that opportunity, you now collaborate in this charade, falsely claiming ownership of my personal possessions. Her voice hardened. Your brother would be ashamed. Ezra flinched as though struck, but Abigail had already returned her attention to Daniels. As for your insinuations about my character and circumstances, let me be perfectly clear. Mr. Hayes saved my life when I was caught in a blizzard. He offered shelter when others refused, asking nothing in return. I've worked honestly for my keep, maintained my dignity in difficult circumstances, and owe no explanations to men like you. She stepped fully alongside Hayes, now no longer behind his protective stance. You will not have my father's Bible, nor his watch, nor anything else of mine. And from what I've observed of Mr. Hayes, you will not have his land either. Not through intimidation, not through legal maneuvering, not through slander. Silence followed her speech, broken only by the soft snort of horses and the distant call of a hawk. Hayes remained motionless beside her, but she sensed his approval in the slight relaxation of his posture. Daniels recovered, first his expression hardening into something ugly. Impressive speech, Mrs. Winters, but ultimately futile. You have until the end of the week to reconsider. His gaze shifted to Hayes. Both of you. Get off my land, Hayes said quietly, raising his rifle slightly. Don't come back without a legal warrant. Next time I won't ask twice. For a tense moment, Daniels seemed to consider pushing further. Then with a curt nod to his companions, he wheeled his horse around. "End of the week," he repeated. "Choose wisely." As the riders departed, Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The confrontation had left her shaking, though, whether from fear or lingering anger, she couldn't tell. "You shouldn't have done that," Hayes said, though his tone held more concern than criticism. "I couldn't stand there and let them." She struggled to articulate the depth of her indignation. "To use my circumstances against me against you, as though being a widow makes me somehow disreputable." "It doesn't," Hayes assured her. "But men like Daniels see vulnerability and exploit it. Now he knows you have spirit, makes you more of a threat in his eyes." Isaiah approached, shotgun still ready. "Think they'll be back," Hayes nodded grimly. "Count on it. Daniels doesn't make idle threats." He turned to Abigail. "We should discuss options." Inside. In the main house, Ruth had hot coffee waiting, her worried expression softening slightly when she saw they were unharmed. "Heard most of it from the window," she said. "That Daniels is a snake. A dangerous one," Hayes agreed, setting his rifle aside but keeping it within reach. "Been trying to consolidate water rights throughout the territory. Controls most of the banks now through his father. Forecloses on ranches, then resells the land at a profit to big eastern cattle operations." "But what does he really want from us?" Abigail asked, cradling her coffee cup. "Surely not just my father's possessions." "Wants me to sell," Hayes said simply, "using you as leverage. Figures if he can cause enough trouble, make accusations about your arrangement here, I might agree to sell just to end it." "That's absurd," Abigail protested. "No one would believe such insinuations." Hayes's expression turned grim. "People believe what they want to believe, especially about a widow and a man living in proximity." He sighed heavily. "Might be best if you did go to Carson City. Once the road's clear, remove his leverage." The suggestion hit Abigail with unexpected force. "You want me to leave?" "Want no." Hayes met her gaze directly. "But it might be safest, for you." "I won't be driven away by threats and innuendo," Abigail said firmly. "That would be letting them win." "This isn't about winning," Hayes countered. "It's about your safety, your reputation." "My reputation is my concern, not yours," Abigail replied more sharply than she intended. Seeing Hayes's expression, she softened her tone. "I appreciate your concern, truly, but I won't allow Daniels to dictate my choices." Hayes studied her for a long moment, something complex moving behind his eyes. "Stubborn woman," he finally said, but there was a hint of admiration in his voice. "Must have learned it from someone." Abigail returned a faint smile, touching her lips, despite the gravity of their situation. Ruth and Isaiah exchanged a knowing glance that neither Hayes nor Abigail noticed, too focused on each other. "So we stand our ground," Hayes concluded, "but cautiously. No one rides alone. Building secured at night, and we send word to Tucker, let him know what's happening." The next several days passed in heightened alertness. Hayes reinforced doors and window shutters, moved the most valuable livestock closer to the main buildings, and kept his rifle constantly at hand. Isaiah patrolled the boundaries, alert for any sign of intruders. Even Ruth contributed to their preparations, stockpiling food and medical supplies in case they found themselves under siege. Throughout these activities, Abigail worked alongside them, refusing to be treated as someone who needed protection rather than as an equal participant in the ranch's defense. She helped Hayes check ammunition, assisted Ruth in organizing supplies, and kept a watch during her assigned hours, a small pistol Hayes had taught her to use within easy reach. 4 days after Daniel's visit, as Abigail stood at the kitchen window washing breakfast dishes, she spotted a lone rider approaching from the east, not the direction from which Daniels had come. She alerted Hayes, who emerged from the barn, with rifle ready, only to lower it as the rider came into clear view. "It's Tucker," he said, relief evident in his voice. The sheriff looked trail-worn as he dismounted, accepting Hayes's offer of coffee with visible gratitude. Inside the main house, he removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Abigail and Ruth. "Daniel's been here, I take it?" he asked without preamble. Hayes nodded. 4 days ago, 5 men, including Ezra Winters, made threats implied he'd file legal complaints about Mrs. Winters' presence here. Tucker sighed heavily. "Man's been busy. Got the Wilsons and Petersons under pressure too, claiming water rights beyond what their deeds specify." He accepted the coffee Ruth offered. "But that's not why I wrote out. Got news you should hear." Something in his tone sent a chill through Abigail. "What is it?" "Fire at the old Thornton cabin near Silver Creek. 2 nights ago, nothing left but ashes now." Abigail sank into a chair, the news striking her with unexpected force. The cabin, her home with Robert Brief, though their time there had been, was gone. Despite everything that had happened, despite knowing she would never return there, the loss felt significant. "Anyone hurt?" Hayes asked. Tucker shook his head. "Place was empty. But here's what you need to know. Folks in Silver Creek are saying it was deliberate. Coal oil found at the scene." "Daniels," Hayes said, his expression darkening. "Can't prove it," Tucker cautioned. "But timing's suspicious. He acquired the property, then it burns days later." The sheriff's weathered face grew serious. "Insurance policy was filed the day before the fire. Substantial one." Abigail looked up sharply. He's claiming insurance money on a property he just acquired. That's fraud, Tucker finished. If it could be proven, but Daniels has the town clerk in his pocket and the insurance adjuster is his second cousin. He turned to Hayes. Point is, he's escalating. Burning property for profit. Might not stop there. Hayes absorbed this information, his jaw tight. You think he'll try the same here? It wasn't a question, but Tucker answered anyway. I think you should be prepared for anything. Man's desperate. Land prices are rising with the railroad coming through. Water rights are gold now. After Tucker departed, promising to return in 2 days with additional news, a heavy silence settled over the kitchen. The sheriff's warning had crystallized the danger they faced, not just threats and legal maneuvering, but the possibility of direct destructive action. He'll come at night, Hayes said, finally thinking aloud. When we're vulnerable. We'll set watches, Isaiah suggested. 2-hour shifts through the night. Hayes nodded. And move everything valuable to the stone shed. It won't burn. As the others discussed practical preparations, Abigail found her thoughts returning to the burned cabin. It represented the last physical connection to her life with Robert, flawed though that life had been revealed to be. Now it was gone, erased by a man's greed, and as surely as Robert himself had been taken by the mine collapse. Yet alongside this sense of loss came a strange feeling of liberation. The cabin had represented both love and deception, beginnings and bitter endings. Its destruction severed one more tie to a past that, while containing precious memories, also held pain and disillusionment. Her future lay elsewhere now. Perhaps in Carson City with her unknown grandmother. Perhaps somewhere else entirely. Or perhaps, she glanced at Hayes, who was explaining to Isaiah the best positions from which to defend the ranch buildings. This stern, wounded man who had saved her life and offered sanctuary without demands. Who respected her independence, even while providing protection. Who carried his own ghost yet still found capacity to care for others. Could her future include him? The question had lingered unasked and unanswered through the winter months. Now with danger pressing close, it seemed simultaneously more urgent and more complicated. That night, Abigail took the first watch alongside Hayes. Both of them positioned near the barn, with clearer views of the approaching trails. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamond dust, the waning moon providing just enough light to distinguish shapes in the darkness. They sat in companionable silence for nearly an hour, alert for any sign of movement beyond the ranch's boundaries. Finally, Hayes spoke, his voice low. Been thinking about what Tucker said, about the cabin burning. Abigail nodded, pulling her coat tighter against the night chill. It's strange. I should feel devastated, but instead I feel, she searched for the right word, released somehow. Hayes glanced at her. Released. The cabin was part of a life that's gone, Abigail explained. A life built partly on lies, as it turned out. I've been carrying it with me all these months, the memories, the questions, the disappointment. She gazed at the stars above. Perhaps now I can truly begin again. Without that shadow. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Beginning again isn't easy, he finally said. Took me years after Elizabeth and Nathan. Still working on it, truth be told. Is that what evergreen is? You're beginning again? He nodded slowly. Built it from nothing. When everything I loved was gone, creating something new. It kept me breathing. One day at a time. Abigail understood completely. She had experienced the same healing power in the daily rhythms of ranch life, the simple necessary tasks that had gradually pulled her back from grief's edge. Thank you, she said softly, for allowing me to be part of it, even temporarily. Hayes turned to face her fully, his expression hidden in shadow, yet somehow more open than she had ever seen it. Doesn't have to be temporary, he said, the words coming with obvious effort. What I said before about staying still stands. Abigail's heart quickened. As your employee, if that's what you want. Hayes hesitated, then continued, his voice rougher. Or as more, if you were inclined. The oblique proposal hung in the night air between them, fraught with possibility. Abigail found herself at a crossroads she had sensed approaching, but hadn't fully prepared to face. I don't know what I want yet, she admitted honestly. After Robert, I need to be certain. Of myself, most of all. Hayes nodded, accepting this without visible disappointment. Understand, no pressure. Just wanted you to know. There's a place for you here, in whatever capacity you choose. Before Abigail could respond, a sound from the direction of the creek caught their attention, a horse's soft nicker quickly muffled. Hayes was instantly alert, rifle raised, signaling for Abigail to stay low. Someone's out there, he whispered. At least one rider, maybe more. Abigail strained her eyes against the darkness, finally discerning movement among the trees bordering the creek. Shadowy figures dismounting, moving with deliberate stealth toward the ranch buildings. Daniels, she whispered. Likely. Hayes's voice was grim. 4, maybe 5 men, armed. What do we do? Get to the house. Alert Isaiah and Ruth. Hayes checked his rifle with practiced hands. I'll create a distraction, draw them away from the buildings. Alarm shot through Abigail. That's too dangerous. They could... No time to argue, Hayes cut her off. Go, now. Reluctantly, Abigail obeyed, staying low as she moved swiftly toward the main house. Behind her, Hayes disappeared into the shadows circling to approach the intruders from an unexpected direction. She reached the house without incident, finding Isaiah already awake and vigilant, alerted by some sixth sense to the approaching danger. Men coming, Abigail reported breathlessly. At least 4. Hayes is trying to draw them away. Isaiah nodded grimly, checking his shotgun. Ruth's in the back room. Stay with her. I'll help the master. I can shoot, Abigail protested. Let me help. Isaiah assessed her for a moment, then nodded. Take position by the north window. Anyone approaches the house, fire a warning. Aim high first. Heart pounding, Abigail moved to the designated window, pistol ready. Outside, the night had erupted into chaos. A shot rang out from the direction Hayes had gone, followed by shouted curses. More shots followed, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating moving figures. Through the window, Abigail could make out 4 men advancing toward the barn, using the structure for cover, as they fired toward Hayes' position near the corral. Isaiah had circled behind the house, presumably to approach from another angle. The attacker's strategy became clear, as one of them broke away carrying something that gleamed dully in the moonlight, a can of coal oil identical to what Tucker had described at the burned cabin. They meant to set fire to the ranch buildings, starting with the barn, where the valuable horses were stabled. Without conscious thought, Abigail raised the pistol and fired through the open window, the shot going well above the man's head, but startling him enough that he dropped the coal oil can. Fire, she shouted at the top of her lungs. They're trying to burn the barn. Her warning galvanized Hayes and Isaiah. Gunfire intensified, more precisely targeted now that the attacker's purpose was known. Abigail saw Hayes emerge from behind the corral, firing steadily, forcing the men to scatter for cover. One of them, she recognized Ezra Winter's distinctive hat, made another attempt to retrieve the fallen coal oil can. Abigail fired again, closer this time, the bullet kicking up dirt near his feet. Ezra scrambled back, cursing loudly. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, neither side able to gain advantage, had fate not intervened in the form of distant hoofbeats, approaching rapidly from the direction of town. The attackers heard it too, their tactics shifting from offense to retreat as the possibility of reinforcements became apparent. Let's go, one of them shouted, Daniels himself, Abigail realized. Now, the attackers withdrew hastily, mounting hidden horses and galloping away just as the new arrivals came into view. Sheriff Tucker and 2 deputies, rifles at the ready. Hayes, Tucker called. Anyone hurt? We're fine, Hayes replied, emerging cautiously from cover. Got here just in time. As the immediate danger passed, Abigail sagged against the window frame, the pistol suddenly heavy in her hand. The entire confrontation had lasted perhaps 15 minutes, yet it felt like hours. Her hands trembled with receding adrenaline, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Ruth appeared beside her, gently taking the gun. You did good, child, the older woman said softly. Real good. Outside, Tucker was examining the abandoned coal oil can, his expression grim. Daniels, he asked Hayes. Him and Ezra Winters. 2 others I didn't recognize. Hayes glanced toward the house, relief visible on his face when he saw Abigail safe at the window. They meant to burn us out. Tucker nodded grimly. Got word they might try something tonight. Rode as fast as we could. He straightened decision forming in his weathered features. This is attempted arson at minimum. Attempted murder at worst. Got enough to arrest them now. If you can find them, Hayes pointed out. Oh, I'll find them, Tucker assured him. Men like Daniels think they're above consequences. Time he learned differently. He turned to his deputies. Johnson, Paulson, scout the creek trail. See if they left anything behind in their hurry. As the deputies departed, Tucker approached the house, tipping his hat respectfully to Abigail. Ma'am, that was some fine shooting. Kept them from getting that coal oil to the barn. I aimed to miss, Abigail admitted. I just wanted to stop them. Worked, didn't it? Tucker smiled briefly, then grew serious. But this isn't over. Daniels won't take kindly to being thwarted, or to me pursuing charges. He turned to Hayes. Might be best if Mrs. Winters weren't here when I bring him in. Man's vindictive. Might try to make good on those threats about her reputation. Hayes nodded slowly. Carson City, he suggested, glancing at Abigail. Too far, Tucker countered. But I could escort her to Rawlins. Judge Hollister's there now for circuit court. She could give a statement, stay in town until this blows over. The suggestion made practical sense, yet Abigail found herself reluctant. I don't want to run, she said firmly. This is my fight too. Not about running, Hayes said gently. About being smart. Daniels has connections in Hollow Creek, but not in Rawlins. You'd be safer there, Bamanchem. He hesitated, then added, I'd join you once things are secured here. The addition surprised her. You would, Hayes nodded. Got business in Rawlins anyway, banking matters. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. Wouldn't leave you alone there. Tucker cleared his throat. Could leave at first light. Roads are clear enough now. Be in Rawlins by nightfall tomorrow. Abigail considered the proposal, weighing her desire to stand her ground against practical considerations. 2 days, she finally conceded. I'll go to Rawlins for 2 days. If charges are filed against Daniels by then, I'll stay until the hearing. If not, I return here. Hayes looked like he might argue, but Tucker nodded. Fair enough, 2 days. He returned to his men, leaving Hayes and Abigail alone in the doorway. Don't like this, Hayes admitted quietly. Sending you away. You're not sending me, Abigail corrected. I'm choosing to go, temporarily. She met his gaze directly. And you promised to follow. I will, he assured her. Soon as I can arrange things here. Make sure Ruth and Isaiah are safe. They stood in silence for a moment, the night's events settling around them like fallen leaves. The uncompleted conversation from their watch, Hayes' oblique proposal, Abigail's uncertain response hung between them, momentarily overshadowed by more immediate concerns, yet not forgotten. Should rest, Hayes finally said. Long ride tomorrow. Abigail nodded, suddenly exhausted now the danger had passed. Will you, she began, then hesitated. Will you keep watch tonight? I'd feel safer knowing you were. Always do, Hayes replied simply. Dawn broke clear and cold, the rising sun casting long shadows across Evergreen Ranch as Abigail prepared for departure. She packed efficiently, the same carpet bag she had carried from Silver Creek months ago, though now containing a few additional items. The dress Ruth had helped her make during the winter. A small wooden carving Isaiah had gifted her at Christmas. Her father's Bible, and watch the items Daniels had falsely claimed. Hayes was conspicuously absent during these preparations, having ridden out at first light to check the cattle after the night's disturbance. Abigail tried not to interpret this as deliberate avoidance, though disappointment nagged at her nonetheless. Sheriff Tucker arrived mid-morning with his deputies ready to escort her to Rawlins. Ruth embraced her warmly, pressing a package of food for the journey into her hands. You come back to us, you hear, the older woman whispered. Man's been half alive for years. You've brought something back to him. Don't let that go. Isaiah squeezed her shoulder with surprising gentleness from such a strong man. Ranch won't be the same without you, he said simply, even for a few days. Their farewells touched Abigail deeply. These people had become more than employers or even friends. They were something like family, a concept she had almost forgotten since her father's death. She was mounting the horse Tucker had provided when hoofbeats announced Hayes' return. He approached at a gallop, reining in sharply beside the assembled group. Thought you'd left already, he said, dismounting with fluid grace despite his evident fatigue. Not without saying goodbye. Abigail replied, searching his face for, she wasn't sure what, some confirmation that what had begun between them would continue beyond this temporary separation. Hayes glanced at Tucker and his men, clearly reluctant to speak freely in their presence. Got something for you, he said instead, reaching into his coat. For the journey. He pressed a small object into her palm, a folded piece of paper wrapped around something solid. Open it later, he advised, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Tucker cleared his throat. Should get moving if we want to reach Jefferson Pass by nightfall, he said tactfully. Hayes nodded, stepping back. Safe travels, he said formally, though his eyes conveyed more than his words. I'll follow in 2 days, 3 at most. I'll hold you to that, Abigail replied, trying for lightness, despite the unexpected emotion tightening her throat. As their small party rode away from Evergreen, Abigail resisted the urge to look back until they reached the ridge that would take the ranch from view. Then she turned in her saddle, taking in the collection of buildings nestled in the valley below the main house, with smoke curling from its chimney, the sturdy barn, the smaller cabins, all of it framed by distant mountains still capped with snow. Hayes stood where she had left him, a solitary figure watching their departure. He raised his hand once in farewell, the gesture somehow both promise and benediction. Only when the ranch had disappeared behind them did Abigail open her hand to examine Hayes' gift. The paper contained a brief note in his angular handwriting, for luck and safe return. Wrapped within was a small object that nearly stopped her heart, a carved wooden ring, simple yet beautiful, polished to a soft gleam. Not a proposal exactly, but perhaps a promise, a possibility. She slipped it onto her finger, surprised to find it fit perfectly. Hayes must have measured while she slept, or perhaps asked Ruth for guidance. Either way, the gesture spoke volumes from a man to whom words came with difficulty. The journey to Rawlins proved uneventful if tiring. They stopped overnight at a way station near Jefferson Pass, continuing at dawn through increasingly populated country. By late afternoon, the town came into view, larger than Silver Creek or Hollow Creek, with proper streets, two-story buildings, and the unmistakable presence of the coming railroad evident in construction at its edges. Tucker escorted Abigail directly to the courthouse, where Judge Hollister, a stern-faced man with penetrating eyes and a reputation for scrupulous fairness, took her statement regarding the attack on Evergreen Ranch. His questions were direct, but not unkind, his manner suggesting he had encountered Jeremiah Daniels, or his type before. Coal oil's becoming a favorite weapon, he observed grimly. Too many accidental fires lately. Insurance companies are starting to ask questions. He studied Abigail thoughtfully. You're sure it was Daniels himself? You saw him clearly. Yes, Your Honor, Abigail confirmed. I recognized his voice as well. He was giving orders to the others. The judge made a note. And Ezra Winters was definitely present. Yes, I saw his distinctive hat, heard his voice as well. Hollister nodded, satisfied. Sheriff Tucker will pursue them with warrants. Until then, I suggest you remain in town. He hesitated, then added more gently. Your situation at the Hayes Ranch, it's unconventional. Might be fodder for gossip, especially if Daniels tries to discredit you. I'm aware, Abigail replied, lifting her chin slightly. But the truth is the truth. Mr. Hayes saved my life and offered shelter when no one else would. There has never been anything improper. The judge's expression suggested he understood the complexities better than most would. The law concerns itself with facts, Mrs. Winters, not rumors. Remember that. Tucker arranged lodging for Abigail at the Widow Parker's boarding house, a respectable establishment that catered primarily to teachers and other unmarried professional women. Mrs. Parker herself was a formidable figure in her 60s who clearly brooked no nonsense but welcomed Abigail with unexpected warmth after Tucker explained her circumstances. Men like Daniels, the widow sniffed disapprovingly, think they own the territory. About time someone stood up to him. The following day passed slowly for Abigail, confined as she was to the boarding house and its immediate surroundings for safety. She occupied herself with helping Mrs. Parker bake bread and mend linens, activities that reminded her of her duties at Evergreen, yet only intensified her sense of displacement. By evening, restlessness drove her to the boarding house's small front parlor, where she sat beside the window, watching occasional passers-by on the street below. She found herself reflexively turning the wooden ring on her finger, the simple object having become a talisman of sorts. Handsome piece, observed Mrs. Parker, entering with a tea tray. Unusual wood. Abigail glanced down at the ring. It was a gift, for luck. The older woman's shrewd eyes assessed both the ring and Abigail's expression. From your rancher, I'd wager. The one who isn't quite your employer, but isn't quite something else yet either. Heat rose to Abigail's cheeks. It's complicated. Isn't it always? Mrs. Parker sighed, pouring tea with practiced precision. My Harold courted me for 3 years before he worked up the courage to propose. Some men need time. Or a push. She winked conspiratorially. Abigail accepted the tea, grateful for the distraction. It's not just that. We've both lost spouses. There are ghosts between us. There always are, dear, Mrs. Parker said gently. The trick isn't exercising them. It's making room for them at the table, so to speak, acknowledging them without letting them rule the house. The wisdom in this simple observation struck Abigail forcefully. She had been thinking of her feelings for Hayes as somehow disloyal to Robert's memory. Perhaps Hayes felt similarly about Elizabeth. Yet love wasn't a finite resource that could be depleted. Perhaps there was room in both their hearts for past and present to coexist. Thank you, she said sincerely. That's very helpful. Mrs. Parker patted her hand. Been where you are, dear. After Harold died, thought I'd never feel anything again. Then Mr. Parker came along, nothing like Harold, mind you. Where Harold was loud and jovial, James was quiet and thoughtful. But he made his own space. Didn't try to replace what was lost. Before Abigail could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention, raised voices, the clatter of horses' hooves on the packed dirt street. Mrs. Parker moved to the window, peering out with interest. Well now, she said, seems Sheriff Tucker's brought in some prisoners. Quite the procession. Abigail joined her at the window, heart quickening at the sight below. Tucker and his deputies were escorting 2 men on horseback, hands bound toward the jailhouse across the street. Even from this distance, she recognized Jeremiah Daniels, his fine coat dusty from travel, his bearing still arrogant despite his circumstances. Beside him rode Ezra Winters, slumped in his saddle, looking considerably worse for wear. He found them. Abigail breathed relief washing through her. He actually found them. Mrs. Parker raised an eyebrow. Friends of yours? Quite the opposite, Abigail replied. The man in the green coat tried to burn down the ranch where I've been staying. The other is my late husband's brother. He collaborated in the attempt. Well, Mrs. Parker exclaimed with evident delight at this drama unfolding on her doorstep. The sheriff works quickly. Judge Hollister won't look kindly on attempted arson. Abigail watched as the prisoners were led into the jailhouse, a weight lifting from her shoulders. With Daniels and Ezra in custody, the immediate threat to Evergreen Ranch and to her reputation was neutralized. Her 2-day commitment to remain in Rawlins would end tomorrow. She could return to the ranch, to Hayes, to the unfinished conversation that might determine her future. The thought both exhilarated and terrified her. Later that evening, Tucker visited the boarding house to update Abigail on developments. Mrs. Parker installed them in the parlor with scrupulous propriety, leaving the door open but retreating to give them privacy. Found them holed up at a line shack near the territory border, Tucker explained. Daniels was planning to lie low until things cooled down. Didn't expect us to track them so quickly. What happens now? Abigail asked. Judge Hollister has scheduled a hearing for tomorrow afternoon. Given the evidence the coal oil can multiple witnesses, I expect he'll bind them over for trial. Tucker's weathered face showed satisfaction. Daniels won't buy his way out of this one. Hollister doesn't bend to influence or money. And Ezra? Tucker's expression softened slightly. Man's a wreck, Mrs. Winters. Drinks got the better of him. Might get leniency if he testifies against Daniels. He hesitated, then added, he was asking for you, actually. Wanted to speak with you. I told him that was your decision entirely. Abigail's immediate instinct was refusal. Ezra had been nothing but cruel since Robert's death, blaming her, stealing from her, eventually collaborating in violence against her. Yet something, perhaps her father's teachings about mercy, perhaps simple curiosity, made her reconsider. "I'll see him," she decided, "tomorrow before the hearing." Tucker nodded, not questioning her choice. "I'll arrange it." He rose to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Hayes sent a telegram. Said to tell you he's settled the matters at the ranch and will arrive tomorrow by noon stage." The news sent a flutter through Abigail's chest. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." After Tucker departed, Abigail returned to the window, her thoughts racing ahead to tomorrow. The hearing that might bring justice. The conversation with Ezra that might bring what closure, understanding, she wasn't sure. And Hayes, coming to Rollins as promised. The wooden ring seemed to warm on her finger at the thought. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, the street illuminated now by gas lamps that cast pools of golden light at regular intervals. So different from the vast, star-filled darkness of Evergreen Ranch. Yet for the first time since leaving, Abigail felt a sense of anticipation rather than displacement. Tomorrow would bring change one way or another. An ending, perhaps. Or more likely, given the wooden ring and the promise it represented, a beginning. Dawn after the blizzard, spring after winter's grip, life continuing, renewing even after the harshest losses. As she prepared for bed that night, Abigail found herself reciting one of her father's favorite scriptures, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven." Perhaps this was her season for renewal, for finding purpose beyond mere survival, for opening her heart to possibilities which she had thought forever closed. With that thought warming her more effectively than the boarding house's quilts, Abigail drifted into the most peaceful sleep she had known in months, the wooden ring still on her finger, a talisman of promise in the Wyoming night.